Good morning, everybody. I think we can go ahead and get started. I think everyone's here except for one person, but I think we should go ahead and get started. I would like to start by, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. We need your input in this committee, so thank you. Like I said, thank you for coming. We'll start with introductions. I guess we can start over here at the end with Terry, if you want to introduce yourself.
Good morning. Terry Sheneman, Coordinator of College and Career Readiness, Fort Bend ISD.
Good morning. Joy Thomas, Associate Director, Financial Aid and Scholarships, Prairie View A&M University.
Brent Williford, Blinn College.
Tom Nguyen, University of North Texas Health Science Center.
Denise Welch, Panola College.
Chad Pulse, Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board.
And I'm Robert Marino, Dean of Financial Aid at San Jacinto College.
Rochelle Garrett, Financial Aid, Stephen F. Austin State University.
Diane Todd Sprague, University of Texas at Austin.
Ed Cressley, Director of Financial Aid, Angelo State University.
Shannon Crossland, Texas Tech University.
Carla Flores, the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley.
Jonathan Sedes, LBJ School of Public Affairs at UT.
Tacey Anderson, Rice University Assistant Director.
Lynn Kenyon, University of Texas at Arlington.
Ben Bolin, Arlington Independent School District.
Foreman Thompson, Dean of Enrollment Management, Midland College.
I'm Thomas Ratliff from Abilene Christian University.
I think we have supposed to have a couple of people on the phone. Kelly, are you on the phone?
Yes, I'm here. Good morning. Kelly Stillman, Director of Financial Aid at Amarillo College.
Christina, are you on the phone?
Yes, I am. Christine Stewart Carruthers, Associate Vice Chancellor of Enrollment Management for Texas State Technical College.
Heidi, are you on the phone?
Yes, I am. This is Heidi Granger, University of Texas at El Paso.
Perfect. I think we're all right. So,
Paul Gallion.
I'm sorry.
Paul Gallion, Jacksonville College. There we go. Jacksonville, Texas.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. As for the overview of the meeting, we have a couple of presentations. We have reports from the subcommittees later on this in the agenda. There are a couple of new things that I want to implement for starting for this meeting. One of them is we're going to take a lunch break. Depending on how we're doing on the agenda, around 12 or so, we'll take a lunch break. From feedback from prior members, it was suggested that we should take a lunch break. It gives us an opportunity to both network with each other so that we can get to know each other, make us more comfortable, having conversations. In addition, it also helps us slow down the meeting because some people felt like it was being rushed. So it gives an opportunity so that we are able to provide feedback. So, okay. So, and like I say, another new thing is that you see a new item on the agenda, item U. I think that will give us an opportunity to bring up new topics for future consideration. I noticed on the past minutes that there was some conversation that were not relevant to the topic at hand, but we still hosted the conversation. And it's now that we'll have an opportunity to move those topics down on the agenda. Okay. Alrighty, so the next item on the agenda is approval of the minutes. Hope that you all had a chance to review the minutes from the previous meeting. If not, I'll give you a few minutes to review them. Okay. Are there any corrections to the minutes? Okay, being none, then I entertain a motion to approve the minutes from the September 5th meeting.
So moved.
Second? Second. Okay. The motion has been moved and second to approve the minutes from the previous meeting. Those in favor? Okay.
Aye.
Okay. Okay, the minutes have been approved. Next item on the agenda is External Relations. John White, Senior Director of External Relations, will give us a presentation.
Good morning. I am John Wyatt, Senior Director of External Relations for the Coordinating Board. I've been asked to give a brief legislative update, and it will be very brief because we are at that point kind of between sessions where people are kind of getting ready for the holidays, and so there's not really that much going on downtown, but there are some things to be aware of. So as you know, the last session ended in May. They are not scheduled to meet again until January of 2021. And we're now in the interim period between sessions. It's during this time that committees will look at issues and consider issues for the next legislative session. So each interim, the Lieutenant Governor and the Speaker release their interim charges. Those charges direct the committees on what specific topics they should examine in the run-up to the next session. On October 30th, Lieutenant Governor Patrick released the interim charges for the Senate. You should have in your materials a copy of the Senate Higher Education interim charges. Looking those over, there were a couple that struck me as they might be particularly relevant to this committee. There's a charge on adult learner students focused on supporting first-time adult learners, re-enrolling students, first-generation students, working adults, and at-risk students being successful in higher education. It certainly seems like a big part of that conversation needs to be about the adequacy of financial aid resources for this population. As you're all aware, our financial aid programs weren't necessarily designed with this population in mind, and so I'm sure there's going to be a lot of conversation about how do we make sure that this population has the resources they need to be successful. There's also several what are called monitoring charges. So these are charges to look at legislation that was passed in previous sessions and update on the implementation of those. One of the monitoring charges is regarding HB 3808. That is the legislation that created the Texas Works paid internship program. You may be aware that rules for the implementation of that program are actually currently published in the Texas Register and will be considered by our cause committee at their meeting in December. So the commissioner and the agency will be updating the legislature on that implementation. But the charge is also more broad than that. It tasks the committee to consider and recommend methods to increase work study and apprenticeship programs throughout the state. So that's something that the legislature obviously had a focus on last session, and they want to continue to expand those opportunities through work-based financial aid opportunities. In terms of the House, we have not seen interim charges for those committees yet. We do expect that those should come out relatively shortly. In terms of the time frame for the rest of session, unlikely that you will see hearings prior to the start of the new year, and probably more likely sometime in the spring. The Senate and the House will really start up having their interim hearings. Usually what they'll do is they will combine 2 or more of their charges into a single hearing, and you can expect to have maybe 4 or 5 hearings over the course of next year. Here at the Coordinating Board, the Commissioner and our staff will work with the committee members, as well as our institutions of higher education, to provide data, analysis, any relevant information that is going to help these committees make good policy decisions. And we're also, over the course of the next year, really taking kind of a broader look at our agency processes for engaging institutions and the legislature on policy. Commissioner Keller has strongly prioritized working collaboratively with our stakeholders to understand their perspectives and advance consensus-based solutions to the challenges that we face in higher education. So we very much look forward to engaging your institutions on these issues to make sure that we really are working in partnership when we go to the legislature with policy recommendations. I will stop there, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions?
Like I said, the good stuff is still a few months away, so.
Yes, definitely. Okay. Okay, all right. Well, thank you, Mr. White.
Thank you.
Next, we have a presentation from the Urban Institute. Cindy Bond and Kristen Blagg, I believe. Are they on the phone? Or?
Yes. Here. Out to you. Hi, you're here. Can you see us? Can you hear us? Okay, great. Okay. Introduction, but okay, all right. So I'm Sandy Baum. I'm with Kristen Blagg, my colleague at the Urban Institute, and we're really excited to have a chance to talk with you today about the project that we're working on to study the Texas state grant programs, and we hope to contribute to strengthening those programs. And based on what we just heard, this is an opportune time for us to be thinking about that. So we are involved in a project that is funded by Arnold Ventures, which is a Texas-based foundation, although we're working in both Texas and New Jersey. And our goal is to talk with lots of different constituents and people who work with, know about, are affected by the state grant programs, think from a public policy perspective about how effective the policies are and what kinds of modifications might be helpful, and then also to get the political context so that we're not sort of suggesting pie-in-the-sky things that won't in any way fit into the political realities of Texas. So we've talked to lots of people, and we have also worked with the Texas student level data to try to get some greater insights into how the programs are working. And so what we would like to do today is talk with you a little bit about some of the issues that have arisen as we've been looking into the programs and see what your thoughts are, what kind of feedback you have as we work to prepare some discussion points and reports to bring to you and other people in Texas for final feedback. So I can't. Are you looking at a PowerPoint at our slides or?
Yes.
Oh, okay, fine. So so then that was the proposed. So the next slide. That was the goals of the program. And the next slide, oh, that doesn't look so good, just explains the funding and what we're doing. And so then the slide after that, starts to talk about some of the issues we've come up with, and I'm going to hand it over to Kristen. But if anybody has any questions about what it is that we're up to, we'd be happy to answer those first before we get more substantive. Okay.
All right, hearing none. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that we've been thinking about or encountering in Texas. One of the most striking things is, while a lot of states have their state grant programs sort of centralized, in Texas, of course, you kind of have a very decentralized system that leads us to focus on the way the institutions are making their allocations of Texas grants and other grant aid. One of the concerns we have about this decentralized system is that there is a bit of uncertainty for the student when they're applying to these schools as to whether they will actually get the aid, and that they may well get a grant at one school and perhaps not another, even though their financial situation is the same for both schools. And so that leads us to some concerns about equity. However, in talking with financial aid officers, one of the things that we've heard is that they appreciate the ability to have that flexibility in packaging for students, and that may allow them to also stretch aid further by using all the different resources they have to put together packages for students. So we understand that this is a little bit of a tension and perhaps not feasible to recommend an overhaul, but something we're interested in getting your perspective on. The next thing is the requirement that students have enough grant aid to cover tuition and fees. And so for many institutions, that means finding additional funds to top students up to that tuition and fees level. And thinking about how the Pell is part of that package for Texas grants, but may not be a part of that for the TOG. And the way that may produce additional funds for living expenses for those who are TOG eligible at institutions that do TOG, but may not for the Texas grant. And finally, we're thinking a bit about the GPA requirement for Texas grant, the 2.5 GPA, which may differ from an institution's Pell requirement. And so we're trying to investigate how many students may fall into sort of the donut hole of getting a Pell grant, but in their second year, maybe not being GPA eligible for the Texas grant.
And let me just add a couple of points to those issues. One, the allocation system of having the money go to the institutions rather than the students. We have from a lot of people concerns about uncertainty, lack of clarity, and perceived inequities in the allocation to different institutions. Like some institutions say, because of some historical accident, we're not getting our share of the money, and we actually don't know until too late how much money. So part of it is the inequity that Kristen talked about across students and the difficulty for students, and part of it is, given the system, you know, is there anything to be done to make it work better for institutions? And then the other issue about covering tuition and fees with grant aid, when Pell Grants included, as they are for Texas grant, one of the things, and this I can't say that this has resonated with people we've talked to in Texas, but the Pell Grant program is very carefully designed to give more resources to the very low income students. It's a slope. You get a full Pell Grant if you have 0 EFC, and you get a smaller Pell Grant if you have some resources, but you still have a lot of financial need. So it's a slope. And when you say your Pell Grant plus other grant aid will add up to tuition and fees if you get a Texas grant, what you are saying is everyone who gets a Texas grant, whether they're a 0 EFC or $2,000 or $3,000 EFC, they get the same total grant aid. So that's very different from the way the Pell Grant program is structured to be sort of a downward slope. And that is an interesting and probably not it's probably not the purpose of covering tuition and fees, but it does effectively mean that every student in that group is getting the same total grant aid. So we're interested in that issue as well. But we're interested in any of your thoughts about any of those three issues. We have other issues we could talk about too, but we expect to have some thoughts about why some of these things do make sense to you, or why they do work well, or why they don't.
Sandy, Kristen, I don't think there's any feedback at this moment, but hello? I don't think there's any feedback at this moment, but we see your email address where we can reach out to you. Is there a particular time that you're trying to wrap this up, your research? Or?
So what you said, I think, was hard to understand, was you not making comments now, but you'd like to email us if you have thoughts about these issues?
It appears to be, yes, ma'am. Okay. I mean, I don't want to cut off anybody, but if there's feedback, please provide it.
Someone on the phone, do you by chance not have your phone on mute? We're getting a whole bunch of static on this end. So if those of you who are teleconferencing, can you just check to make sure you're on mute?
That came through very clearly to us, by the way, that comment.
Well, we have the opportunity with Sandy and Kristen here. I want to make sure that we kind of dig into some of these pieces that they're bringing up. Sandy, you mentioned that in your conversations, there'd been concerns about the equity of the allocations. And I'd be interested in hearing from the committee members whether or not they're aware of any concerns about the equity of the allocations, because that's a piece that, we approach allocations within the state through the negotiated rulemaking process, and so we bring together the representatives, so our allocation process is an attempt to be representative of what the field of financial aid views as an equitable process. So I know the agency would be very interested in hearing the Financial Aid Committee's feedback on potential issues with the allocation process.
So I'm just going to say from a Texas grant perspective, we went through the reallocation process a couple of years ago, and I think that significant efforts were made to make that more equitable across the state within the current regulation guidelines. So what we talked about at that time was it was not just an issue of what your incoming freshman class size was, but it was also having to fund the continuing students first, since that's really our direction. And what we are trying to do is not only get to an access point, but a success point. Again, staying with the 60 by 30 idea is that Texas grant is critical for these students to be retained and get to graduation. If the funding were to change, that would be a significant detriment to the student.
I think also for the community colleges, the TEOG, we went through a similar, reallocation process and did our best to base it on the neediest students getting. The allocation is so small to begin with. I mean, we have to have some way to put it out there. So I think the level of frustration may be that the initial allocation for our Texas grant programs, we would just like to have more money in that, I think is what the frustration is on our end.
That's very interesting because that seems very logical, but we are hearing from a lot of people that they are just grateful that the money is there. And actually, we're hearing less than we thought we would about the money not being adequate, and in particular because of the fact that a relatively small share of eligible students are actually getting the Texas grant, right? So it seems like that would be a frustration on campuses.
So, Sandy, I'm not sure if I'm going to direct this correctly, but what I think I'm hearing from you is that you didn't hear from a lot of colleges about their allocations not being sufficient. I will tell you when we went through that negotiation process that there were several institutions that had significant changes to their allocations. Mine was one of them. It got severely downgraded. However, I understood the logic behind trying to make this more equitable statewide. The issue, what Denise is saying is that was the overarching conversation, I think, this last year, going to the state legislature and saying, we understand that this needs to be fair statewide, but state legislature needs to look at how much more support they can give. I will tell you in my 11 years here that our support peaked about, what was it, somewhere between 2006 and 2008, and then there was a severe decline, and we're slowly getting back to that point, but we're just now getting back to where we were a number of years ago.
Right. And what about the constraint of having to cover full tuition and fees for all grant recipients? Obviously means that you're giving more grant aid to fewer students, and I mean, it's just a trade-off. I mean, it's not at all clear in terms of supporting student success, which you're talking about is clearly a primary goal. Whether it makes sense to do it that way, is that something that institutions find to be really a problem, or are institutions satisfied with that regulation because of seeing that at least those students are getting a reasonable amount of aid?
Go, Brent.
This is Brent from Blinn College. I would tend to say we were probably the only school and two-year school in this situation because probably 90+% of our students are out of district, while most of the two-year schools in the state, the majority of their students are in district. So we're spending between $400,000 and $450,000 in additional grant money to cover the tuition and fees that the TEOG does not cover. And so the last couple of years, I've been arguing that I fail to understand how at a two-year school where tuition is still half the cost of a university, the university is able to use Pell to match, but at a two-year school we can't. And so that's $450,000 a year that are not going to other students. That's just TPEG. That doesn't even count the SEOG that they're also getting awarded, that gets counted in that calculation. So for our school, it is significant.
That's really interesting. You said 90% are out of district?
Yes, we are in a more rural area and close to a very large university. So we have a lot of students come from outside the area, and our district is very small. Our largest population campus is outside of our district too.
That's really, so the students who don't get the state grant aid and don't get their tuition and fees covered are paying a lot to go to your institution.
Correct.
Right, okay.
Not probably half of what you would at a four-year school, but significantly more than they may be at other junior colleges, because, say, in the Houston area, you have so many community colleges that the majority of the students are in district, and ours are not.
So this issue is very related, that whether you can use Pell or not is very related to the question of living expenses. And the issue of living expenses, I mean, two things that we've been surprised not to hear more about are, one, how do students cover their living expenses? And two, what about older students being excluded? So we're curious about your take on those issues and whether there's a lot of frustration about that, or whether they just don't worry people too much, or what your perceptions are.
Well, I think there is a general concern with financial aid not being enough to cover all cost. I know particularly in our college, we know that Pell Grant and other grant scholarships will be used for tuition fees, book supplies, but we're looking into what about external costs. Our average age in our college is 24 years old, so we have a lot of working adults coming to our college, and the average enrollment is 8.1 hours, so it means that they're not taking more a full-time load because they're having to work. So we're trying to figure out how to help them meet the external costs so that they can take a larger load and finish earlier. We're having to partner with non-for-profit organizations in the area so that we can cover housing and food insecurity as such. I think that is the general consensus among the colleges, how we're trying to meet that other living expenses.
At Blinn, we do have on-campus housing, and a third to half of our students on that campus are usually receiving TEOG because they're the lowest income students. Because Pell is not a matching factor in TEOG, it helps them afford the housing because the housing is expensive. But we're also wrestling with, here's $450,000 that didn't get sent to other students. So the students are grant heavy, but without that matching, with the inability to match with Pell, some of them are having to borrow a little less than they would if Pell was a matching. So it's on one hand, we would like to see Pell included in the matching. On the other hand, some of the students, it would not be an advantage to. Depends on what angle you're coming from.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you want to?
Sandy, one of the questions you had, or one of the statements you had made early on, or maybe Kristen made it, was in relation to the decentralized system and the individual decisions that are able to be made on the college campuses with these programs, as well as tying that to the tuition and fee requirement, that tuition and fees need to be covered for recipients of the Texas grant and the TEOG. And I think that's an important piece to hear feedback from everyone. Texas has a very unique a very unique grant program from other states in that it is decentralized, but it does have the tuition and fee requirement to it. Without a tuition and fee requirement, it could be a centralized program like a Pell Grant or other states where, the state just determines a level and the student takes that to wherever they're going to go. Would end up with more students getting less money across that. So it'd be very interesting to hear people's thoughts on the trade-offs of these pieces. Brent has made some comments about the fact that, going in another direction allows an institution to then use, their funding, their campus-based funding in different ways as opposed to tying it into the tuition and fees. But then those students that were benefiting from that and having funding to cover their living costs and things like that wouldn't necessarily have that coverage unless the institution decided. So that's an ongoing piece. I know that there's been comments made in the past about removing the tuition and fee requirement to just provide institutions with the ability to spread funding. What are the implications of that if you end up having more students getting less, more students served, but those students get less funding?
I think with that, we could possibly see the student loans would go up, obviously, because if you're giving more students less money, they still have to meet those costs, whether it's direct or indirect. So I think that the possibility of the student at my school that gets TEOG, I'm very fortunate. Our costs are very low. That TEOG does cover their tuition and fees, especially my in-district students. And so they use their Pell for living expenses, whether that's on campus or off campus. But those that don't have that option, of course, student loans is where they go. And so I think you could see a possible increase in our student lending.
I think just to kind of pivot off of that, because especially during my undergraduate, I did receive a number of grants and such, and it was a significant amount that covered. And this was at UTEP with a low cost of living, very low tuition rates, and very low resources and stuff. Without such significant help, it's true. The only other track would have been, I don't have a home to live in, or I take out the loans. And especially with my first semester at Texas Tech, when certain amounts weren't covered and stuff, I took out a $7,000 loan, and now it's matured up to $10K. So, that's the only other option, honestly. Just from the, the student perspective, at least in that case.
Do you, as financial aid administrators, feel that the tuition and fee matching requirement is a critical piece to the structure of the Texas financial aid programs?
A couple comments, just listening to the conversation. I think one thing to acknowledge, the diversity of our institutions and the diversity of students that we serve create a great challenge to create a single system that is going to work for everybody. And so if nothing else, these are the rules we've lived by for a while, and so we figured out how to utilize those in ways that are positive. The idea of a decentralized, there are benefits to that, but I think you're right in the sense that, have we really had a debate to say, what if we changed it up? Because that's not necessarily the only way to do it, and there are many states that have very different ways of doing it. My one feeling, and it's really the tuition and fee concept that exists within the program, Texas grant is kind of like a golden ticket. And if you get that golden ticket your first year, because you happen to have the right EFC and you happen to meet priority model, you do everything on time, then you're guaranteed for your 4 years, as long as you continue to have some level of need, that your tuition and fees are going to be covered. I mean, that's huge. And it's also one that, if you don't get that ticket, either because you're just past that threshold of qualifying, that's a cliff. So unlike the Pell Grant, like you say, where it's a gradual decrease of eligibility of aid, there's a cliff. And if you hit that cliff, depending on schools' packaging philosophies, you may go from full tuition and fees to getting, a few $1,000s to help meet your financial need, even though you have unmet need and, all of that. So, I mean, again, that depends on school strategies and, again, limited resources that we have with Texas Grant to meet all of the Texas Grant eligible students, as well as grants, funds set asides to meet the other needs of the students. So, I mean, that's the ongoing struggle that we deal with. But, I think that is something that I struggle with is, like you say, you get that golden ticket, you're setting pretty good. And again, a lot of it's on you because you need to be academically successful, especially after that second year. You need to be doing better than what is needed just to get your degree at the institution, and you need to be making progress, which I don't know is a bad threshold, but somewhat counters the idea we want to graduate students. And, if you graduate with a 2.3 GPA, is that less of a success for the state than a student graduating with a 2.6 GPA, and yet that student is funded for their last 2 years, whereas the other student isn't. So those are just some of the challenges, but I don't know what the answers are. I mean, I guess it's interesting that you're looking at it as to what's right, but, there are, I guess I would acknowledge there are reasons why the rules are and the allocations are the way they have been. Doesn't mean they always need to be that way, but I don't think they're just arbitrary and not done with the sense of concepts of equity, concepts of student success, concepts of reaching the state's goals. And to, blow up the system or disrupt the system, as much as it sounds interesting to have the conversation, frustrating possibly to have the conversation, either because, we'll talk about it, but will anything really change? And even more frustrating, the system's changed, and then all of a sudden we have a different set of winners and losers because of the new system, until we get to the idea that we're fully funding the needs of our students.
Can I just say thank you? That was really interesting. I like your golden ticket analogy. But our questioning and our delving into this, it doesn't mean we're certainly not starting with any conclusions about what we think should happen. But it also is much more likely to be like not blow up the system, but think about ways that it could be tweaked so that it would more effectively meet the state's goals. I just don't want you to think that we're trying to do something explosive here.
Right, and I may be a little dramatic in that term, and I've been watching the Democratic presidential candidates too much, where you got people who want to blow up and people who want to make slight changes to reach the same goals. And I would say the end goal is what's in mind, and I think you can get there many ways. So I apologize if I'm implying, a criticism of, of what's being done here, and that it's an attempt to blow up the system. So.
And I just want to add on to Ed's comments with that golden ticket. I think from a university perspective, we have to think about our promise programs that so many institutions, and we rely on the Texas grant with the Pell to be able to fulfill that.
Ed mentioned about the GPA requirement and the fact that the state programs, you have to have the 2.5 after the second year, and just interested in hearing other people's thoughts on the impact of that and how it helps or hinders our programs.
It is very difficult to explain to students. It appears to be an arbitrary barrier. If you're talking to a student one-on-one and you're saying, okay, you had Texas grant, now you don't, you still have your Pell, you still have your institutional aid, that's very difficult for them to wrap their heads around.
Yeah, in my college, we lose about half of our initial students to this second year because the GPA requirement. You know, we have a minimum requirement across the board for federal aid, but also they maintain that, but then they lose their TLG.
I agree that consistency does help in managing most of the programs, and I believe at the last meeting we discussed consistency between federal regulations and state regulations. So I think that discussion it would help a lot in mimicking a lot of those rules in order to be able to explain to a student. Times we do have trouble doing that.
I thought Ed's point about the fact that if you have a 2.3 GPA student who loses their grant and then potentially doesn't graduate because they don't have the funding to continue, does that benefit the state as a whole to have lost that potential graduate?
It's Kelly. I'd just like to interject here about our non-resident students that depend on our TEOG funding. The 2.5 or GPA is a huge barrier for those students because if they don't meet that target, then they lose out on the only fund source that they have with us, and so then they're kind of left hanging out there, and we're scrambling to try to help them find scholarship funding or something that they can qualify for.
And which population are you talking about?
I'm sorry, our students that complete the TASFA application that don't qualify for the federal financial aid.
Okay, so they're residents, they're just through the affidavit process.
Yes.
Okay. I got a little worried that you were awarding it to non-residents, so I just wanted to make sure.
Well, this conversation is very consistent with what we've heard from other people. Frustration about the confusion over those two different GPA requirements. But it's also interesting. There seems to be a lot in some of the provisions of sort of wanting to give the money to the students who are most likely to succeed, and with the logic that, you know, if students aren't going to make it through college, why are we giving them the money? But then one of you brought up this tension over, well, maybe if we gave them the money, they would actually be able to get through. And are you taking students who are on the brink of success and on the brink of being able to complete their degrees and then not funding them and therefore losing them? I mean, the students who are, you know, doing really, really well are probably actually the ones who are most likely to be able to finish, even, not that you should take the money away, but even if you did. And so I think looking at that question is one of the things that we would like to sort of gain more insight into how much impact that GPA requirement really is having, and we're going to try to look at that with the data.
I know. Oh, sorry.
Okay. Now, one of the things I just found out in my college to do a presentation for my board of directors is that the more financial aid student receives, the better they tend to do academically, per semester by semester, and persistence, you know, to completion. So I looked at the students who receive a lower amount than the standard amount, and they were dropping out. But the more financially they receive, the more they were completing. So basically it comes down to give them more money and they'll finish. At least that was my conclusion. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
This is Christine. We've actually seen that a step further, that the students who are choosing to enroll in our institution are doing so because they have enough aid to cover their tuition, and if they don't, their chances of enrolling drop to about 30%.
Well. Sandy, on your slides, I just want to comment on the fact that you have a slide, one of the slides says about difficulties in covering transfer students.
Yeah.
We've covered that topic in great depth in this committee. And actually, this committee is really kind of what brought a lot of the issue to light as to the transfer students and those students going into the four-year institutions and how few of them are being funded through the Texas Grant Program. So I just wanted to point that out, that it's not that the committee doesn't share that concern, it's just that we've kind of analyzed that one or talked about that one extensively in this committee.
Do you have a solution?
I think there was a conclusion, and at the end of the day, it really is inadequate funding. Because, with the priorities that are already set with us when we get to the transfer population, there isn't typically money left over. So that is the challenges. So if there were money, then I think the discussion has been, could we create better pathways for students transitioning from the junior college, the first 2 years into the school, and carrying that state eligibility, a different form, but state eligibility with them in a way that they would know they qualify, they would know that's available, and then ultimately there would be funds available that we could give to those students. So, my conclusion of the conversations we've had, and I'll just give my conclusion, is until we have adequate funding, really having a conversation about better pathways is somewhat futile. So, and that, that's my take only.
Well, and one of the challenges we also talked about was the fact that, while it's a decentralized program, providing you, the institutions, the ability to kind of make decisions in the awarding, there are aspects of the awarding requirements, particularly the priority model, that limit your ability to try to serve different populations. So, that funding limitation that we're facing, part of the challenge of the funding limitation is that institutions are required to fund the priority model students first, after which there's not much funding left for the other populations. So it's a combination of the funding level and the restrictions. It's been indicated that those restrictions also do that. So I think those combined, it's kind of a challenge that it's a decentralized program, but not a decentralized program in the sense of how many requirements are put on there. So.
Right. I mean, constant tension of, in order to take a fixed amount of money and more generously fund some group of students that is now left out, you can only do that by taking it away from somebody else, right? And so there are not good solutions to that. But it does seem like this transfer student issue really is a pretty big problem with the system, given the goals. It's good that you've talked. I mean, we would love to know any ideas that you have come up with in past conversations and so on. We want to make sure that we include those in our discussion too.
If I might add, I guess just a slight tidbit to consider. for one, at least on the student perspective, the grant matching, the tuition matching does provide a lot of ease of mind, per se, especially as I've gone through all the financial aid processes and everything else. So that sort, just having that has always been a little bit easier. But I think another thing to possibly consider for the student perspective, I know that we primarily focus on the thresholds between whether students are going to stay in class and be able to succeed academically. But I think, and of course this is for like the ideal world and everything, but also to consider how this affects like the fifth class. And by the fifth class, this is an analogy that is used at the school. You have your 9 hours or your 12 credit hours and everything else of that sort, but then you have like the extracurricular activities and such for students who may not have, the time to be able to involve themselves in these networking opportunities or these personal enrichment programs or anything else of that sort, because they're focused on being able to scrape by and such. It also, it not only affects their grades, but it also affects that fifth class aspect, and really a lot of the enriching and transformative experiences that these students can be able to go through that, help them excel throughout. So I think it's just another small tidbit to kind of consider, especially as we look at all these thresholds, but beyond that, and some of those kind of metaphysical realms that we don't always take a look at.
Any other feedback? Go ahead.
We're very grateful for the chance to talk with you and for your thoughts. And if you have further thoughts, we would love to hear them. So please feel free to stay in touch with us and let us know if you go away and say, oh, I should have said this, or if there's something that you didn't want to actually say in this forum, but that you think would be good for us to know. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Sandy. Kristen.
Thank you.
Okay, so moving on to the agenda, the next item on the agenda is proposed update to Texas Administrative Code, Ginger, Senior Director in Innovation and Policy Development.
Good morning. Still morning, I think, for a little while longer. Thank you for your time this morning. Related to any rules that are about financial aid practices or policies, we really appreciate the opportunity to present them to you before we advance them through agency processes. So based on our conversation today, these changes will presumably go to the March cause or CAPS meeting and then to the April board meeting. So, as you know, Senator Zeliger sponsored a bill to clarify the legislation around SB 887, or the student debt letter, because he wanted to make sure that his legislative intent was upheld, and his intent was regarding private loans, that they are not required to be part of the student debt letter. So SB 241 from the most recent legislative session is to clarify that private loans are not required. So I know this is a lot. Let me just walk you through it. So these are the proposed changes for your review. And I've shown them using track changes here so you can see what we've actually changed. Of the 5 sections in the current administrative code, we're only changing 1 section. And of that 1 section, 21.49, there are 6 subject sections, and we're only changing 1. So let me walk you through what those changes are. So we took advantage of the rule change process, since we knew we were going to go through it for SB 241. We wanted to address some frequently asked questions about the debt letter. So the language underlined in gold is what we've added to clarify the rules. The language underlined in blue is the language we've added to address Senator Zeliger's SB 241, that private loans are not required. So over the last year and a half, we've received a lot of questions asking about state loans accrued at other institutions. So staff have determined that state loans, under the intent of this law, are not considered private loans. So state loans are not considered private loans. And so using the language of the bill, state loans must be included in the letter. That being said, the caveat is that what must be included for state loans are those incurred while the current student is at your institution. So if the student incurred state loans while at another institution, you could include those if you reasonably have access to them. But it may not be information that you have, so then you would not be able to include it. But you do have the information about state loans at your institution. This is why we're referring to the difference between state and federal loans in our changes. So I think, go back. Okay, so this may also section that we've added, so that refers to state loans at other institutions may be included if you have them. Private loan information may be included if you have it. So we included this may also language because we wanted to give institutions who have already integrated private loans into their letter the opportunity to keep those should they choose to. But this does hopefully clarify that they are not required, but they may be included. These are just some relevant links for the rule change, the original legislation, the Senator Zeliger's bill from the 86th session, the education code, the administrative code, and I've just included those there for those of you referring online or watching online. You can click through those to find that. Do want to remind you also we have some resources available for you as you implement your student debt letters. We had 2 webinars last year, one with Indiana University, who was the first institution that we know of that implemented a student debt letter, and the second was with You Aspire to help you think about the language to use so that it's easy for students to understand. So those links are to those webinars. And also want to let you know that the student debt letter questions have been managed thus far through my division, Innovation and Policy Development, but we are moving them over to Chad's area, and that will be forthcoming. We'll keep you updated on that. So at this point, I'm happy to answer any questions. I wasn't quite sure how to present the text in a way that would be easy for you to see how we've made the changes, because I know track changes can be a little bit of an eyesore. But again, happy to answer any questions about this. Do you have any comments? Any comments you want to share?
I think this will be helpful for us as we're trying to get the letter. I mean, it would be great to include all loans for the students in the letter. However, we don't have an easy way to extract that information from the coordinating board database and put on the letter. In this LDS, although loans are included in there and the ISER, but not for state loans. So just giving us the ability to, may and may not include it, I think is helpful for the institutions.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for your time. Feel free to follow up with any questions if you have them, and otherwise you will be seeing this on the agenda for the March committee meetings and then the April board meeting. Okay.
And so timing-wise, I'm guessing then that this will probably go into the Texas Register probably in February, late January?
So I believe so. We're already technically past the internal deadline to let's ask Michelle. She can tell us more. So, but I think Michelle's going to be understanding of the delay, the slight delay. So, what is the time frame for the Texas Register?
I believe that January it gets routed for approvals, and I believe it's
Yeah, I don't think we're behind for the March meeting.
Oh, okay, good.
I think you're,
No,
you're
we're
good
fine
right
on the
now.
March meeting, so, because I guess
It's usually
I'll-
about 2 months before the meeting.
Yeah. So
So
after
we'll-
the new year, you'll see this posted in the Texas Register for the 30-day comment period. So, but hopefully, if you're all thinking that it looks okay, hopefully the rest of the financial aid community will also think that it's okay.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Gormans. Okay. Okay. Okay, the next item on the agenda is the election of the vice chair. I don't know if you have had a chance to talk to each other, but the committee will now entertain nominations of.
What?
You have to vote for this, for the vice chair.
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Well, we need nominations first.
So we need. Okay. So the committee will entertain nominations for the vice chair, and dependent on the number of nominations, we'll get to vote on the individual. Any nominations?
Robert, could you explain the role of the vice chair?
Oh, sure. The vice chair is basically the chair in waiting. Okay. It would be when my term is over, the vice chair will take over as the chair next year. What they're going to be doing is just basically working with me and preparing, me and Dr. Pools, and preparing the information for the meeting, for the next meeting, and just staying informed on the committee's activities, because like the next year they'll take over. Yeah.
And are there any restrictions as far as who can be nominated or preferences as far as second-year members or anything like that?
There's nothing in our rules that have any specifics on that. One thing to be aware of is the vice chair is a 3-year term. You'll spend the next time as vice chair, then next September it would be the transition, and so take over as chair next November, December, and then you spend a year as past chair, providing advice and guidance to the chair and the vice chair. And the chairs, the 3 chairs, are the primary group that I use as staff liaison to the Financial Aid Advisory Committee to connect with in between the meetings for decisions that need to be made that don't require the approval of the entire committee.
Okay. Any nominations?
Kind of hard to nominate someone until you've had an opportunity to talk to them to see if they're willing to serve. Is there a possibility we could maybe table this till after lunch so we can have an opportunity to visit with members to see if who we would like to nominate is wanting to take on the responsibility and able to do that? Is that possible? I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm the only one that feels that way.
Okay. Yes. So one of the things that'll be helpful for me is to know, like in the materials when we talked at the last meeting, we had talked about the fact that this was going to be coming up and encouraging everyone to be talking with each other. Now, Lynn, I realize you're new to the committee, but others of you aren't new to the committee. So any feedback you have as to how to make it more clear that this is coming up, because I know people are kind of looking like they're surprised that we need a vice chair, but we have talked about this in prior meetings. And so I would look for some feedback from you all independently as to what can the agency do to make it more clear that this is an important piece for us to prepare for each meeting.
Chad, one thing that might be helpful is if we have a really simple operational calendar for the committee ahead of time for the year. Because I know we also had a situation last year where we didn't get the, I don't know if it was the nomination, but the approval of Robert at a time. So he was like, it was delayed?
We didn't, it didn't make it onto the open meeting posting.
yeah.
So, and we do have a, that I can share, a standard meeting agenda topics for each of the 4 meetings of things that we know will be on each of the meetings. Like we know that we'll always have this nomination. So that's definitely something that I can share.
That'd be great.
Absolutely.
Just a question, and I don't know if this is possible. Would it be feasible to ask if anyone would be interested, and then I guess we can vote on that, like know who would be interested in being a vice? I don't know if that's possible. To the,
I'm sorry, not quite understanding what you're.
would we be able to ask who would be interested in being a vice chair, and then that way we know who?
Oh, you can self-nominate. Like if there's anyone interested in being vice chair, you can self-nominate yourself.
Okay.
Yeah, so.
I guess if anyone is interested, that way we know that that person is.
Okay.
So
I was
I
just
guess
asking.
Carla's asking, would anyone like to self-nominate themselves?
Or you want to
Yeah,
nominate
that's definitely the nomination process is, sorry, this is the first year that we've had this struggle. So all the other years, people have been nominated, so.
Well, I have someone I'd like to nominate, but I just don't know if the person is interested.
They can always say no. I guess maybe I should mention, like in past years, people have nominated people and the other people have said, nope, I'm not interested, or yep, I am interested, so.
Well,
If you would like to
I
nominate.
would like to nominate Ed. Are you interested, Ed? Yeah. Do you want to say?
I'm not opposed.
Okay. Okay, there you go.
I'm willing
You
to
have a
say.
no- I nominate you then.
Okay, thank you.
Would anyone else like to self-nominate or make a nomination of another person?
It's not that bad. Okay, so we have one nomination. I guess if there's no, we need the motion to approve, right? Unanimous vote. Since we only have one nomination, we can move forward with the vote and to, I guess, elect Ed as the vice chair and to be chair for the next year. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second? A second? Okay, so it has been moved and second, and to elect Ed as the next vice chair. Okay, all those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
Aye.
Same sign?
Aye.
Oh, okay. So, all right, so the ayes have it. Ed has been elected as the vice chair. Okay.
Congratulations.
Okay, so next item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes dates. I believe you emailed them, didn't you?
Yes.
Okay. So you should have received an email with it for future meeting dates. I gotta look them up myself.
This is Christine. I move to accept the meeting date.
Okay. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay. So the dates have been has been moved and second to approve the proposed meeting dates. All those in favor say aye.
You have to ask for discussion.
I'm sorry, any discussion?
We have to make sure
Yeah.
that we have discussion in case anyone, we have to make sure we have discussion in case anyone has any concerns about the dates or anything like that.
Sorry, thank you.
Because approval is the assumption that you understand when the dates are and that you will come to the meetings on those dates.
You want to just repeat the dates, Chad?
Sure. The proposed dates, they're the first Thursdays, at the first Thursday of March, which is, whoops, I clicked too fast, which is March 5th, and then the first Thursday of June, which is the 4th of June, the first Thursday of September, which is the 3rd of September. One thing to note, Labor Day is later this year, and so the first Thursday is before Labor Day as opposed to after Labor Day. And then the first Thursday of December, nope, I'm sorry, that's a lie. We actually looked at doing it we proposed the second Thursday of December, the 10th of December. The reason for that being so that it would not conflict with the FSA conference.
Any more discussion? Okay, being none, I'll call the vote. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. All those opposed, same sign. Okay. All right, the ayes have it. The dates have been approved. Okay, the next item on the agenda, I want to take a minute to discuss the expectations of the committee members. I know I had a discussion this morning with new members, and we went over the operations of the committee. So I want to go over again with the current members so that remind you of the requirements of the committee meeting. One of them is being that you are to review all material, prior to the committee meeting. This way you come prepare and we can have a thoughtful conversation. In addition, you're expected to attend the meetings. If you miss more than 2 meetings in a row, you're not to miss more than 2 meetings in a row. If you miss 3 meetings for the year, your membership could be canceled.
No, I'm sorry, I need to clarify. Okay. If you miss 3 meetings in a row or you miss 3 meetings in a year, you automatically vacate your position on the committee.
So, if you cannot make it to the meeting, you can assign a non-voting substitute, a participant. Also, you can call in, but however, we strongly recommend that you come in. We can have a better conversation face to face. Also, all the meeting days, agendas, step notes, recording, roster, and all the staff contact, they're posted on the Coordinating Board website. Please bookmark it because that's where you will find the proposed agenda and any past content from the previous meetings. As far as for lunch, like I said, this is the first time we want to have a lunch break during the meeting. In the future, the Coordinating Board will not pay for your lunch, so you're expected to bring cash so that you can pay for lunch during the lunch break.
Since that's new, let me just clarify for everyone. We'll provide you with information in advance so that we can gather orders and let you know how much it'll be. The agency doesn't have funds to be able to cover foods, and so Robert was gracious enough to be able to have his institution cover the lunch for this first time. But we'll definitely reach out to you a week or 2 in advance to make all the lunch coordinations. We just ask that you make sure you bring cash that day so that then we can cover everything. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so that's all I have on this topic. The next. Are there any questions? Okay. Next item on the agenda is prior Financial Advisory Committee business. Dr. Poole?
Actually, in looking through the prior agendas, I don't have anything specific under the prior business section since everything I was going to talk about has its own agenda item for us to talk about. So we'll cover all those items.
So the next item on the agenda is the Financial Aid Wellness Learning Collaborate with from the College Readiness and Success. Aaron Willen, Program Specialist.
Apparently we have a substitute.
I think I'm substituting for Aaron today. So Good morning, everybody. My name is Brian Ashton, and I serve as the sort of co-convener, I think, with Aaron in the College Readiness and Success Division for the Financial Wellness Learning Collaborative. Erin is out sick today and sends her regrets for being here, but told me that I could tell you to direct all the hard questions to her and that her email address can be circulated so I don't have to answer any questions throughout the presentation. But in all seriousness, if you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to let me know as we go through this here this morning. Wanted to talk a little bit about the Financial Wellness Learning Collaborative. And so this is a group that we convened in conjunction with the coordinating board to really follow up on the work that was presented out of the Financial Literacy Advisory Committee report. And so Chad was was the lead on the Financial Literacy Advisory Committee through the Student Financial Aid Programs Division. Once that report was produced, it was handed off to the College Readiness and Success Division as kind of the topic of financial wellness became more owned by that division than the Student Financial Aid Program side. And the Learning Collaborative is a little bit different of a structure than the Advisory Committee. And so when we put together the Learning Collaborative, really one of the major differences is that we're looking at this as just a one-year standing committee. And so we're about halfway through that year that we've been working with the Learning Collaborative. And the idea behind it is to bring together higher education professionals from different roles, institutions, and parts of the state to have conversations about how we can implement some of the financial wellness recommendations that came out of the Financial Literacy Advisory Committee. And we've pulled together, if we want to go to the next slide here, sort of the logic model, if you will, that we've used for the Learning Collaborative is that we started by bringing together the inputs. And one of the inputs was that financial literacy report that was published as a part of the work of the advisory committee. We also brought together, like I said, the individuals from around the state, which your new vice chair, Ed, is one of those. And he truly has been watching the Democratic debates by the deferral of the nomination, I think. We also brought together folks that really have a lot of creativity, openness to change and learning, and then the time to really dive a little bit deeper into these issues. Over the last few months, we've had regular conference calls to help the individuals learn from each other and to share some information about what is happening on their campus, but also to hear about some national trends as well as local trends that are happening around the state. And then we've convened specific work groups, which we'll touch on in the next slide, to help dive a little bit further into 3 areas that we identified as priorities for the Learning Collaborative. We're looking at outputs here over the next few months, and those outputs include a student program survey and report, a Texas on-course training module for advisors in particular to dive a little bit further into topics of financial literacy and wellness, some minimum standards and promising practices, and then a couple deliverables in the report form that we're still working through determining what they will ultimately end up being. What we hope to come out of this on the back end is really a network of professionals at various different types of institutions of higher education that can be seen as leaders in the financial wellness space. These individuals can then help to be resources to inform ongoing state efforts about this, not just at the coordinating board, but elsewhere, but also serve as practitioners that can help to advance other campuses as they go through the journey of implementing financial wellness programs. Longer term, what we really hope is to reiterate Texas's leadership in the space of financial wellness, in particular with advancing some evidence-based practices to help educate students about their finances and the financial decisions that they're making, to help think more critically about how institutional policies impact student financial wellness, and then to provide some of those, again, minimum standards for what a best practice of a program may look like. If we go to the next slide, you'll see sort of a breakdown of the collaborative members here. We have 13 members. We have had some attrition. We've lost one member throughout the process due to a position change at their institution. This makes up 4 community colleges and 9 public universities, and we're able to represent 8 out of the 12 higher education regions in the state. One of the things that we were very intentional about in the design of the collaborative was to make sure that we had sort of the full spectrum of employment represented through the group. And so we have directors and sort of that more higher level individual who's at the macro level of institutional policy and conversation. And we also have frontline staff members that are providing day-to-day student service. And within that, we have individuals that are within financial aid departments. We have some faculty. We have individuals who are within student affairs and student services departments and enrollment management departments as well. So the idea really behind that learning collaborative is to have that holistic representation of people that are influencing student finances as a part of their position. The next slide here, we asked the members to complete a SOAR analysis at the beginning of the collaborative. And so this is a strengths, opportunities, aspirations, and results analysis. And what we received was sort of this feedback that's presented in this diagram. And so the first thing that we saw was a general consensus from the group that we were grounded by strong existing programs in the state of Texas. And fortunate to have leadership, attention, funding, and networks to draw on. And so Texas has been seen as a leader in financial wellness and financial literacy over the past few decades, and really truly has been at the forefront of conversations around how we can better educate students about their finances. And so we know that there's a strong existing infrastructure, and that was very, very well represented in the group. That being said, we have an opportunity to sort of reaffirm that commitment and to continue to be a leader as a state, and thinking about how we can now take what we've seen in financial wellness programming, which we've seen an increase in the number of programs around the country on college campuses. We haven't necessarily seen the subsequent increase in sharing of data-driven results and effectiveness data that we would like to see to prove kind of that next frontier of the programs are there, are they actually working? And we see Texas as being able to really take a leadership role in that conversation, given that strong foundation that we have. The next piece here was, a part of a conversation, and if we can stay on that slide real quick, where the collaborative has an aspiration to really create a systemic approach to educating students about financial wellness. And so we had conversations about this in an in-person meeting that we had, I think about a week ago. And as a part of that conversation, we really reaffirmed the idea that in order to impact student financial wellness, we first have to impact the system level before we can impact the individual education, and that the educational efforts are made much more effective by that broader systematic influence in making sure that we are being cognizant of the various inputs that impact the student's ability to make financial decisions. And then kind of the results here that we're hoping from the collaborative. We touched on these a little bit earlier, but we seek to have tangible positive impacts on student financial wellness. And that tangible piece, I think, is key, because really thinking about how do we assess these efforts and provide data that the interventions that campuses are providing are effective. If we go to the last slide here, one of the things that we wanted to do to make the best use of the individual's time that we brought together was develop working groups. And so the collaborative meets on a monthly basis as a collective group, and that's really for information sharing and trend dissemination. But then the individual work groups, which also meet monthly, are the bulk of the work that's happening in the collaborative. We'll touch on the three work groups that we've developed here. The first is a training design work group, and the predominant focus of this group has been working with Texas OnCourse to develop a module to train higher education advisors on how to talk to students about financial wellness. And so Texas OnCourse has some very strong modules that are really centered around financial aid and helping individuals to work through the various aid applications, as well as the understanding of the various aid options that are available to them. There isn't really an OnCourse module or a part of that training that is focused on how do we help students to understand the budgeting concepts or the idea of talking to family about money, those types of questions that go into a more holistic decision about the college process beyond just the aid. And then the ability to really be successful on the back end as they then need to manage their money when they get to school. We had a conversation about sort of the idea earlier today that if we don't have the prerequisite aid or the financial aid package, the sense of belonging and other things that go into student retention are moot if we can't pay the bill. And a part of that financial aid package and our charge here has really been to evaluate what the financial wellness and budgeting and other aspects are that contribute to that. As a part of this, we've sent out surveys to practitioners across various campuses to collect data, and have been working with the OnCourse instructional designers to help design that. I think we'll be looking at this maybe being a little bit later. Most of the deliverables associated with the collaborative will be available in spring of 2020. This one may lag a little bit just due to the development schedule with OnCourse, but we do anticipate having a module out in 2020. The second working group here that we put together was a policy and procedure working group. And so one of the things that we've seen is that financial wellness is an environmental concept, right? And that it's not just student education that influences a student's ability to be financially well on a campus, but oftentimes our policies and procedures impact that. So when a student is dropped for non-payment and how we navigate the process of dropping a student for non-payment, how we position items in an award letter to a student, all of these are institutional decisions that add up to creating an ecosystem of financial wellness or not financial wellness for a student. So the purpose of this group is to evaluate a few key quote unquote pain points that a student may experience that the institution has some localized control over, and provide some guiding questions to help campus administrators to think through what they are doing that may influence the student's ability to be successful. This is something that we are trying to tie into some other coordinating board initiatives, and so we know that there's been a lot of more siloed work that has happened in this, including things like open educational resources, and thinking about how we can bring that all together under the guise of student financial wellness and present a little bit more of a roadmap for campuses to think about those questions. The last group that we pulled together was a student programs group, and this group was intended to really put out a survey. One of the things that we don't know is how many campuses are providing student financial wellness programming, what is the scope of that programming, and you know, how are they administering that programming. And so the coordinating board sent out a survey to every institution in the state. Some of you may have filled it out on behalf of your presidents and chancellors that may have forwarded it on to you. But we received a great response rate to that survey, and we have a lot of really rich data that we're working through right now. And the intent is to have kind of a initial draft of those results in early 2020, and ultimately use that as a strong baseline for years to come to see, as we move forward with more intentional financial wellness program across the state, are we seeing growth in some of these metrics? And are we seeing more programs that are coming to fruition as a result of some of the work? This will be the first of its kind in the country, really taking a look at what is happening at a statewide level and beginning to provide some semblance of understanding of budgets and staffing and programming opportunities that are being provided. If there are any questions, I'd be more than happy to take them. I did not do this anywhere near the justice that Aaron would have, so I do apologize for that. That's what you get for the pinch hitter, I guess, up here. But I think, kind of in closing, the work that the Financial Literacy Advisory Committee did was a very strong body of work to lay a foundation for thinking about a statewide approach to financial literacy, or we brought in that a little bit to be financial wellness as a part of this. And we know that there's goals that are obviously in 60 by 30 that are related to student loan debt, and that is one of the key goals of 60 by 30. We also think, as a part of kind of this learning collaborative, that the work being done to understand financial wellness and to advance the conversation about financial wellness plays into those retention and graduation goals as well, and that in order to have a conversation about retention and success, we need to also include part of that conversation around student finances. And so we hope that this is used sort of across 60 by 30 and can not only be used to inform the work of offices like yours and the financial aid department, but truly can be representative of the diverse group that we have and be campus-wide in nature is the intent. Like I said, more than happy to answer any questions, or if I totally butchered that, I can give you Erin's email address right now, and she can add clarity. She might be watching on YouTube and getting mad at me right now. Any questions on that?
I'm just going to piggyback on what you were saying about broad representation across the institutions, and that's actually part of the reason why once the Financial Literacy Advisory Committee was completed, as an agency, we decided that it was best housed in college readiness and success as opposed to student financial aid programs, because we didn't want to convey an indication that financial wellness is just a financial aid activity. It's much broader. Financial aid is a critical part of financial wellness, but financial wellness isn't just for your financial aid students. It's for all students, and it's not just about their aid they're receiving. It's about everything related to preparing them to be knowledgeable individuals. So I just wanted to give everyone some background on that very purposeful move over to the college readiness and success area.
Yeah, good. And Brian, I just want to thank you for the statewide approach they are taking. Like I said, this helps with the 60 by 30 goal, but it also helps with the accredited agencies. Yes. I know Sachs COC has Principle 12 that asks institutions to prove how they're addressing student debt. My institution was able to meet that by putting together all of our different financial literacy, financial wellness programs that we have on campus, and that we got approved because that met the requirements. And now having a statewide approach will help us standardize it across the state.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Ask a question.
Yeah.
Was there a discussion in the meetings about how this financial wellness approach could be also collaboratively used with high school students?
Yeah, so that's been kind of a reoccurring conversation, and it was certainly a conversation on the Financial Literacy Advisory Committee as well, and sort of what's the role of the crossover into the P through 12, K through 12 environment. Part of the Financial Literacy Advisory Committee was thinking about how do we create some common brand that goes across and provide a trusted information source, if you will, for people to turn to. And I think that's something that we've discussed a little bit as a part of the collaborative as well. What we've talked about, especially as it relates to policy and procedure, is that this starts when a student expresses really interest in an institution. And so if the student has expressed interest in going to higher education, that's really where the journey of an institution's role in the financial wellness space begins. And so we've been attempting to start there without overstepping the bounds into, sort of the high school programming aspect. And obviously are interested to see what opportunities are there long-term from a House Bill 3 perspective and some of the ongoing efforts that are happening. But it is a part of the conversation, but not the focal point of the conversation, I'd say. Yep. Ed, anything to add? All right. Any other questions?
All right. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you all for the time.
So it's noon.
Michelle, do we know if lunch is here yet? Yes. It is here? Okay.
All right, then we need to vote to take a pause, or
What?
we need to vote to take a pause?
No.
No? Okay. All right, so let's take a 30-minute break, have lunch, talk to each other, and then we'll come back. Yeah.
Just for clarification, the lunch is set up in the Tejas room, is that correct? So we'll be going through those doors over there into the Tejas room, and we can all sit down over there and enjoy lunch.
Yes. Yep. Absolutely.
I'm going to get back to Houston.
Okay.
On down early on my last meeting. Don't see what you have for lunch.
Okay, we're going to get started. If you're on the teleconference, if you could be sure to mute your phone. Whoever's vacuuming, could you mute your phone? Maybe you're on an airplane. You're driving. If you're on the phone, could you let us know that you're on the phone? Okay. Kelly, are you on the phone? Christine, are you on the phone?
Yes, I'm on the phone.
Heidi, are you on the phone? Paul, are you on the phone? I apologize for those of you who are on the phone, but I fear we're going to have to disconnect the connection because we can't hear on this end. There's very loud noise coming through the phone. We're going to disconnect the call. I was just about to say that. So, can you send them an email to ask them to? No, to read. Oh no, I was just saying, could you send them an email to have them call back in? Because, yeah. Why don't you go ahead and get started while we work on getting them back on the line?
All right, so let's get back. Okay, so let's get started again. Next item on the agenda is a presentation to the annual report presented by Diane, past chair.
So one of the duties of the chair is to develop this report that will be presented then to the coordinating board, and it gives them an idea of the interaction between this committee and the coordinating board. One of the things that I focused on initially was the current recommendations and as to why, as Chad indicated before, and I'm not sure if this was at the orientation or here in the meeting, but the board does look at this every 4 years as to whether the committee would continue or not. This gives them some idea of the interaction that's going on between the community and the coordinating board. And what we're really focusing on has been the strengthening of the how we approach strengthening the programs so that students have access to higher education, and again, this idea of retention, right in line with the 60 by 30. So the fact that we can interact with the coordinating board and discuss and give feedback on the initiatives where it would have a real impact on state financial aid programs is absolutely critical. To work with the FAIC in seeking feedback on how the state programs could align with federal programs. The intent here, as we've been talking with Chad, is make sure that to the extent possible we can eliminate any artificial barriers to students. That is the last thing that we want to happen for students, that they have this confusion as to how I qualify for a state program and keep my state program as opposed to a federal program. The subcommittees, I think, have been invaluable relative to the work with FAIC. The Data Collection Committee has done a tremendous amount of work on the FADS reporting and the auto grant payment process, and that, I think, has given a lot of value add, both for FAIC and the community. Okay, let me make sure I'm losing my place here, I'm sorry. And then we do give feedback on legislative issues. We've had an amazing opportunity in the last couple of years as John and others have given us information about what it is that the coordinating board and the legislature are considering, that we have an opportunity to come forth and say, hey, can you look at this, do some historical analysis? We can provide some analysis to let you know how this would impact the student population that we're all trying to serve. And to continue working on the electronic TASFA. I hope you all understand that that's now part of that was passed this last year, that is something that was supposed to be in play for 2021, correct?
22-23.
22-23, thank you. So very excited about that possibility and what that would allow our students across the state to have easier access to providing that information. Last year, we also started the new member orientation for the first time. Those of you that attended this morning, I hope that you found this valuable. I will tell you that I think that Chad and Robert did an amazing job on building on what we had started last year. I found it extremely informative, and I think it's going to make your jobs a lot easier, and you're going to be able to just jump in and join all of these discussions. Last year that we hosted a number of sessions. Chad has been very active in finding things that are of interest to all of us and bringing that forth so that we understand some of the things that are happening in the wide community and just gain knowledge on some of the topics that are being discussed nationally. Talked a little bit about the FAAC Subcommittee for Data. Now we're also going to talk about the TASFA Subcommittee, and I think that work has been very well placed. I don't know if you all have experienced it, but we've experienced it on our campus. This issue of the selective service question has been a real problem for us because we're having to go out and poll a lot of students and get a lot of information that we had relied on the Fafsa. And then for those students that aren't necessarily filing a Fafsa but getting the waivers and exemptions, we're having to go back and get that information now. So the fact that we might have an avenue through the e-TASFA, or I don't know what you're going to call it. I shouldn't call it e-TASFA, I'm sorry. Through the electronic TASFA, that would be an amazing benefit to the students. Subcommittee, as I indicated before, has just done amazing work this last year. I think that's an extremely valuable committee, and if anyone has some interest in that, I would advocate that you join that group because they do some really good work. And then just listed some of the bills that we had talked about this last year and the input that we had given. So going forward, the last paragraph is just a description on some of this value add. I honestly, with all of my heart, I'm sorry, I don't know why that bothers me. I honestly believe with all my heart that this is an extremely valuable committee. And the input that you all provide is serving the students of the state. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dan. The next item on the agenda is the committee report from the TASFA Subcommittee. The only thing that I have to report is, of course, we did not meet since the last committee meeting. But I did reach out to Claudette Jenks at the Division of College Readiness and Success to find out more about House Bill 2140, what Diane mentioned about the online TASFA, whatever they call it. They are working, or they're doing proposed rules right now for the TASFA Advisory Committee. Is in the 30-day comment period, supposed to expire November 25th. So if you have an input about the rules for the advisory committee, please go and provide your feedback. They're hoping to open up the nominations begin in February 2020. So if you're interested in participating in the TASFA advisory committee, they would write up a proposal for the January 2001 for the board, and then we hopes to bring the e-task file, whatever they call it, online. Please do, nominate yourself or nominate someone in your college. Other than that, that's the report for the Task Force Subcommittee. Next, we have on the agenda is the Data Collection Subcommittee. Samantha's not able to make it, but Deshay, I believe you want to substitute for her. Okay.
Good afternoon. I had to double check. I'm like, it's not morning, afternoon. Good afternoon. I wanted to give an update about the Data Collection Subcommittee. We met on October 30th, and we went over several different topics. And I'll give you a listing of the topics that we talked about and the outcome from those particular topics. We discussed the update to the grant payment system, as well as a proposal to redesign net price calculator. We also looked into the Move It account as far as users are concerned. And then we also looked into the FAD cycles and reconciliation. So for the net price calculator redesign, we are putting up a proposal to redesign that particular tool, because we've learned that it can be very cumbersome with the students when they use the information from the three times that they can pull a school, and the information may not be as consistent as it needs to be. And so we're looking to redesign it to make it easier for the students to read it, make it easier for the institutions, and make sure that we're in full compliance for that particular calculator, since it is required for the public institutions to provide data for it. We're setting up that proposal the first week of December to our IT steering committee, and the feedback that we received from the committee, from the data collection committee, was just to make sure that whatever design that we're looking at, that we look for consistency across the board on how institutions are to provide that data to the coordinating board, just to make sure it's very clear and concise. And then also provide additional training so everyone across the board for the institutions understand how to upload any data. So our proposal is looking two ways. One is if we can do it in-house to redesign it, or potentially if we need to go out for a third-party vendor. We won't know the approval of that particular project until after we meet with that steering committee. Next, we talked about, again, was the Move It account. We looked into the security of Move It, because as you may or may not be familiar with that particular portal, it does require an institution login, and so it's not an individual account. So it's whoever is at the institution that can use their login, and it's across the board for the institution. So as an agency, we're very into looking at security here, and so we wanted to talk to the committee on if we made any changes over to the user account, what would that look like for the institutions? How could we roll out that particular project? And so we got some feedback from the committee just to make sure that we notify institutions beforehand. It's not going to impact any reporting that could come up, and just to make sure that when we do any kind of transitioning over from an institutional account to an individual account, we ensure that it does, like I said, does not impact any reporting, and that we get all the correct users at the institution. And so, again, we're looking into that. It would be a later project that will come somewhere down the road. My particular area will particularly co-sponsor that, but will be led by our IT department, and we'll give out more information as we get closer into rolling that particular project out. We also talked about the updates to the grant payment system, as far as anything that we are improving on that particular system. So we rolled out a new system as of August 1st to make it far easier for administrators at the institution to request money. Hopefully some of you all are familiar with it and have seen that particular system. And so it requires you to log into the CB Pass, and then you're only asked 2 items to request money, and that is the amount of money you plan to request and the student count, and you submit that. Some of the feedback that we received from our data collection subcommittee was if we could offer a email notification once a submission is done, and then also if we can provide a email notification once the approval for a disbursement is going to be made. The reason behind that is because you do have other areas across the institutions who are waiting for those funds outside of just within financial aid. And if they don't have access to the not move it, the CB Pass application for grant payment, it's very hard for them to know how to track it down or who submitted it. And so it'd be very helpful to get some type of email notification sent to that requester who can then forward on to the other people around their institutions. And so we're looking at doing that as an improvement. Also, we're looking, and just recently that should be live right now, is to extract data out of the transaction details screen. So that way, if you needed to kind of look at any reconciliation about how much money have you requested, any money that you returned, you can easily extract that through an Excel spreadsheet. So there should be an export button now on the transaction details that will allow you to export that data out of the system. And then also allow you to look at the document number. So if we have dispersed funds and you're needing the business office to locate the document number for that disbursement would be in a column on the transaction details. And so some of that information will be helpful for those who may need that information across the institutions. And again, we're hoping to wrap up any improvements to that particular application by the end of this calendar year. Lastly, we talked about FADs. Our favorite subject is FADs, right? Everyone loves FADs. Yes, there we go. Woohoo! I need some more woohoos. So with FADs, we've done a really good job over the course of 2 years when it comes to FADs and making improvements of it. But we also want to continue to streamline that particular process. And one of the areas that we focused a lot of our attention on was the reconciliation process. That seemed to be one of the areas that some administrators may have a little more trouble getting closer to finishing the FADs process. A lot of that reconciliation concerns happen during cycle 2. And so with reporting cycle 2, it's very fluid, and when we're using numbers that the coordinating board has versus what the institution is putting on the file, they don't always match up. And so some feedback that the collection subcommittee talked about doing for future FAD cycles is to kind of revisit reconciliation for cycle 2, where you don't have to actually reconcile for cycle 2, but provide the data to the schools who can still see where they're at. We've made some changes to the way that you can request money for the grant programs. And so when you have a later request date, that can also fluctuate your numbers. Student loans is another area that is very hard to reconcile, especially during the summer. And so if we don't have just a error for reconciliation in reporting cycle 2, then it will allow at least the administrators to have the ability to look at what they have reported so far. So by the time they get to cycle 3, when it'll be the more official reconciliation, then they'll be able to have cleaned up everything. So instead of making reconciliation a requirement for cycle 2, make it more of an informational piece to where it will still provide the numbers and the figures that the coordinating board has versus what you have on your particular file, and that would ease the process. We also talked about mentorship as far as the reconciliation for those institutions who participate in mentorship. And they've made some significant improvements going into the 1920 FAD cycle. They are reducing their number of reporting that's going to be required for those institutions down to 2 reports that would happen in June and in September. They've also are looking at enhancing the reporting where you're not going to have to do it by paper so much, but looking at an online reporting system, which will then eventually feed into FADs. That's something similar with our grant payment system that would also feed those numbers that we've dispersed aid into the FADs reconciliation. Another thing that I want to say that the mentorship program has also been looking at is looking at their rules and how to make sure to align them. And so they'll be continuously working with our particular area to ensure that the information that they provide aligns with the rules that are set out for the mentorship. So I know there have been a few discussions about mentorship as far as reconciliation, and so that was some of the things that got brought up during our particular staff, our committee meeting, was to kind of talk about how we want to overall streamline reconciliation beyond just certain programs that may cause a little more challenges with the schools. We also looked at eliminating those duplicated elements that happen on FAD. So if we're reporting elements in another reporting such as CBM 001, and then we're also doing the same thing on FADs. How do we eliminate those elements in FADs when we can get them elsewhere? And so we're going to have to go through and look at FADs carefully and compare it to other reports throughout the agency where we may have duplicated data elements, and then determine where is it best fit for, so we don't have inconsistency with information. And I think that is all the discussion for FADs. I just wanted to bring up some of the dates that we discussed for the next FAD year, which would be 1920. And these particular dates that are set out are for cycle 1. The opening would be February 10th, 2020. And the deadline would be April 17th, 2020. And that's for the first cycle. For cycle 2, it would open up June 22nd, and the deadline would be August 28th, 2020. Then for cycle 3, it would open up September 28th, 2020, and the deadline date would be December 11th, 2020. We try to keep those dates kind of consistent with what happened in 1819, but we also looked at any reporting concerns that may have come up, especially in that second cycle, that have impacted some institutions when they did have to report mentorship for that June 5th reporting period. So we wanted to push it back to allow those schools enough opportunity to get their information in and for the coordinating board to review anything. I believe that was all that we had for that particular committee. Are there any questions from you all?
No, but I will appreciate the emails from the disbursement system. My business office was looking for, hounding me every day, where's the money, where's the money?
Right. Well, good.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Deshane.
Thank you.
Okay, next item on the agenda is the Legislative Recommendation Subcommittee. Shannon, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the Financial Aid Advisory Committee and guests. Thank you for the opportunity to serve on this committee. We had just started in October getting our committee together, representative of sectors throughout the state. I feel that we have a very good committee, and they're represented here on this handout. We reviewed our purpose, and we set our goals, our timeline during our first meeting. We want to explore legislative recommendations for the 87th legislative session, representative of the various sectors. We would like to have, and we will have, a proposal for some recommendations prior to our March 20 meeting so that all of you can review those, and we'll be in constant conversations with Dr. Pools and Mr. Chairman regarding those so that we can give you the best available for that one. We have discussed some topics for recommendations. I don't want to spill too much until we get more in depth, and we will be having that call next month. But some of the things that we are looking at are federal and state alignment opportunities. That seems to be a hot topic, especially related to the selective service, the SAP, and aligning controlled substance requirements with federal aid requirements. Those are some of the things that we're looking at. We're looking at populations not being served. And I think that goes back to the presentation earlier with the interim charges from the Senate in that adult learners piece. I think we can incorporate those first generations and look at those populations not being served as well into this. But that also ties in, the more we have our discussions, we're seeing that that is tying into the federal and state alignment. So we're looking at, we can group those. We're looking at work as a resource. We're looking at the priority financial aid deadline. And then we're looking at, we've kind of tossed some little things around that really didn't fit into these groupings, but discussions regarding the possible considerations for promise programs in the future, things we need to start thinking about for the future as more institutions come on board. Course program of study, how is that going to affect? We need to start thinking about that. As we think about these, we want to think well into the future and align these so that they will align with those as well if those are ever to come in. And then the net price calculator. We're also looking at that for possibly a revamp of the current platform. That's kind of at the bottom of our list, but as we get together and discuss more, we were going to put a formal recommendation together in consult with Mr. Chairman and Dr. Poles and provide that at the March 2020 meeting. And I'm happy to entertain any questions or suggestions that you may have.
Okay. Well, looking forward for the proposal.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next item is the task bar recommendations and feedback. Leanne.
I don't have any recommendations or anything at this point. TASFA's year just began November the 1st, so our first official board meeting is going to be in December, actually December 12th and 13th in San Antonio. So hopefully by our next meeting, I'll have some information to share with you.
Okay. Thank you, Leanne. Next item on agenda, well, Terry's no longer with us. Today actually was his last meeting. So are we going to be nominating somebody to take over that committee?
No, the committee, that's just the feedback.
Oh, feedback, okay.
From that.
Oh, that's just feedback.
Just for those of you who might not have heard him talking, Terry actually has recently retired from his position at Fort Bend, and so Shona has graciously accepted a nomination to fill the remainder of his term, and so we'll be taking that nomination to the next CAP meeting, or we just took it or something. I can never get the timing right. She's not official yet, but she's going to be official by our next meeting. Okay. So there's the technical way of putting it.
Okay. Okay, all right, thank you. Next item is discussion of Fafsa State Deadline language by Dr. Quintero Pools. Keep forgetting your first name.
Quintero Pools.
Quintero Pools. Yeah.
So, if you all would look to the second to last page in your handouts, every year, NASGAP, the National Association of State Student Aid, State Grant Aid Administrators, they are the ones who coordinate getting the feedback from all the individual states as to how the language will appear on the FAFSA regarding the FAFSA deadline. And so what I've been working to do is to try to get ahead of the curve, because oftentimes in the beginning I was kind of just telling you what we'd figured out to do, and wanting to actually get your input beforehand before they come asking. Right now what you'll see is what Texas currently says in regards to the FAFSA deadline. This is something that this committee has tweaked over the past couple years to refine it, much shorter than it used to be. And wanted to connect with you all as to whether you think there are any additional tweaks that need to occur, or whether the wording you feel is solid and can continue.
Chad, I have a question.
Yes.
So I'm looking down at the bottom, and it's January 15th with a hashtag and then an asterisk or a star.
Yes, if you go up above, it's those.
Yeah, so the star is additional forms? Are there additional forms?
Some institutions may have their own additional forms. And so that's the language that, like those top items about the symbols, those are standard language that the Department of Ed uses. And so that was intended for schools that might have their own application or might require taxes before they award or things like that.
Is there some sense of how, I mean, this compares to other states' statements? I mean, I've not for a long time looked at all the state statements, but what's your impression of how this reads compared to what other states are?
I think now we're much more in line with the majority of states. We definitely used to be a much longer statement. We were in some of the states that had big, long ones. There are some states that go into all sorts of details. But in terms of now, I think we're kind of more streamlined like other states are saying. So. Anyone have any concerns about the agency continuing to use this language when they come knocking? No. Okay, then when NASGAP calls, I'll already have that task accomplished. Thank you very much.
And it looks like you have the next couple of items.
Yes, I do. Proposed updates to the Texas Administrative Code. Just wanted to give you a heads up on when you'll see some things go into the Texas Register. We had talked about several different items at the last committee meeting, just to get your feedback. Wanted to let you know that the proposed changes to the TEOG program, as well as to old conditional grant programs that we had for teachers that were discussed in the last meeting. They're going to be posted in the Texas Register probably late January, early February, in preparation for the March CAP meeting. Also, the updates that we talked about at the last meeting for the Texas Armed Services Scholarship Program, those are actually undergoing further review right now. We're looking to try to see what we can do within the rules to strengthen participation in the program and the opportunities for successful completion of service, because the task program requires a service commitment after graduation. And so we're looking to try to reduce some artificial barriers to completion, for lack of a better word, as well as to try to improve participation and nominations from legislators, et cetera. So after we talked about it at the last meeting, we actually ended up diving into it more deeply. So wanted to give you the heads up that when that gets posted in late January, early February, it'll actually look a bit different from what we discussed in the last meeting in an effort to strengthen that program. We talked about some updates to the Be On Time program at the last meeting. We actually are delaying the posting of those until June, May, probably late April, early May. And the reason for that is so that rather than doing a posting now and a posting 6 months later to eliminate the things that aren't necessary once the program is fully over, we're just going to do a posting next spring so that we can delete all the rules that relate to making any kind of new awards since that program is phasing out and no new awards will be allowed in that program after this current year. And then finally, the item that I'd like to talk a bit more about is an item that we'd been talking about. It was in the presentation that I made at the last meeting about ideas for consideration in regards to statutes and the like. I also talked about it at the Financial Aid Advisory Committee meeting. I'm sorry, this is the Financial Aid Advisory Committee at the TASFA conference to get feedback on the challenges that the priority financial aid deadline challenges that have been raised about that. And one of the things that we started talking about internally is whether or not there's any opportunity to try to address the challenges via rule as opposed to trying to pursue a statute change. Right now, the statute requires that we set that the agency work with financial aid offices to set a priority deadline that applies to general academic teaching institutions, which is basically the four-year institutions plus the Lamars. But it doesn't define in statute anything about what that deadline needs to be. And in talking with you all and talking with the TASFA conference, there was the challenges that were brought up in terms of some of the things that this interacts with. We talked about how it interacts with transfer students and the challenges that the deadline is long before most transfer students are even looking into the transfer process. Some of the challenges that it has in terms of impacting a school's flexibility to award to different populations because of the priority deadline. Challenges when it comes to students that are moving between our sectors. So, in the 2-year, they experience one set of application timing, and then in the 4-year, they all of a sudden have a different. Some of the feedback that I've received, both in this meeting at the TASFA, is that there is a priority deadline, but the true deadline is still inconsistent across institutions. Some schools use an even earlier date. Some schools use an earlier date. Some schools, it's really a priority. For some schools, it's really a cutoff that if you didn't apply by that deadline, you're not going to get funding. Then on the reverse, some schools have to spend a lot of time explaining it's not a cutoff, it's just a priority. Financial aid administrators have brought up that the diversity of the types of students make it very difficult to have a common priority deadline, and that common date doesn't benefit each institution the same way. It's having very different impacts. Also, the fact that priority is not a guarantee of funding. A question has been raised as to whether moving the date, it was March 15th, based on consideration of a subcommittee and the Financial Aid Advisory Committee input, it was moved to January 15th. But just a question as to whether that move actually made a difference in the process. And in many ways, the priority date ends up being a rationing tool as opposed to, I think, the ultimate goal, and it was mentioned in this that, the idea was it was an encouragement to try to get people to make sure they get it done, but is it actually achieving that goal, or is it becoming a deterrent to individuals who may have missed the deadline and assume, okay, well, I missed the deadline, so, what's the point in filling it out? HB3 also brings in the extra challenge that FAFSA is now going to be required for high school graduation. And so partially there's a question of is the priority deadline redundant to the high school graduation requirement, and what happens if the high school has a different deadline for completing than the priority deadline, since likely, and this is just my personal guess, they're probably not going to set the deadline as January 15th because they're going to want to graduate their students. And so the deadline will probably be much closer to actual graduation dates. And so what's that going to cause in terms of counseling for you all when a student says, but I did my FAFSA by the deadline my high school told me I had to do the FAFSA, and then explaining, well, yes, that was for your graduation, but for financial aid, you had to have done your FAFSA by this. So there is a challenge that's coming up that we're going to have to, as we, meaning the financial aid community, are going to have to figure out. So there's all this stuff that we've been talking about. So one of the ideas that we floated was whether or not the priority deadline should actually be later in terms of the state mandated priority deadline, to potentially try to put it more in line with what schools might be doing for the graduation requirement and things like that, and being less of less an attempt to try to articulate what every single institution is going to use, but somehow moving to a later date. technically Pell, your deadline is the end of the year, the end of the academic year that you were in. You can still fill it out in the spring, and if you're there, you can still be considered for financial aid. Now, federal aid is more quote-unquote entitlement for your Pell and Direct, but like your SEOG, filling it out at the end of the year, you're probably not going to get any SEOG funding from that. So wanted to toss that idea out there of whether there's an opportunity of just kind of moving the priority deadline later, thus kind of allowing institutions to be doing more of what they see as what's required for their individual schools, and potentially not having it become some kind of deterrent that people think, I missed the January 15th deadline, and so there's no point in me applying, or having the deadline before transfer students even start applying for transfer and the like. The idea was trying to figure out, is there a way to do it in rule as opposed to statute, because rule is easier to change than statute. So no decision whatsoever has been made at the agency on this. It's just we've started to float the idea, and this is the perfect group to give us some guidance on whether we should continue exploring that idea, or whether you think, no, that wouldn't work.
I have a question.
Sure.
And it's may be showing my ignorance here because I don't work directly with Texas Grant anymore. But the priority model is tied to the priority date, is it not? Or is that still true?
The priority model isn't tied to the priority date. Actually, one of the things we're exploring right now and have asked for some input from our general counsel, we have the priority model, we have the priority deadline, we have the priority EFC, and we have priority to continuing students before returning students. And a question we've been receiving from institutions is, which trumps which? Which is the first one that should come into place? And we're trying to figure out the answer to that. But in terms of the actual statute of the priority model section, the priority deadline isn't in the priority model statute. It's a different section of the statute that addresses the priority deadline, which then is also a different section. Because priority deadline actually relates to all state aid, though it only relates to general academic teaching institutions, so it really only relates to the Texas grant. And then the EFC piece is within individual programs. And then the continuing over new is in the rule of the different programs. And then priority model is unique to Texas grant. Yeah, and that's why we're trying to make sure we get some good clarification on this as to which trumps which and which is required. And that's another piece that kind of brought up the topic of those pieces, is the priority deadline impacting the Texas grants priority model, is kind of which is more important, the academic concept that the priority model is trying to drive, or a straight time-based deadline, and which is the more critical. Sorry, that was a long answer to your question. I apologize.
So the comment that it's a deterrent for students that they didn't apply after the priority deadline, well, that's fixing to go away. If I may use that East Texas slang, it's fixing to go away, because every high school student is going to be required to fill out the Fafsa before they can graduate from high school. So do we need to change the priority deadline? because it's really not going to be a deterrent as much anymore as it would have been if they were just coming out of high school and they weren't required to fill out the FAFSA and they were in a hole somewhere and their high school counselor changed 5 times and they didn't know, I mean, you know, all of the scenarios you can think of where the students would not get the information. Since it's going to be required, that may be something that we don't really have to consider anymore as far as the student, it being a deterrent for the student. Does that make sense?
The one piece that I'd say, adding on to that, is that with that, you've kind of got the diversity of student type. For the direct from high school students, likely that there's going to be more knowledge there from the requirement, but from the returning student, you know, or the transfer student who didn't need financial aid to pursue their community college coursework, but now they're going to need financial aid because they're going to transfer to a 4-year public or private. I think you still have, and given that I'm not positive that it's the majority of our students, but a large chunk of our student population isn't direct from high school, you know, how are they going to be impacted?
Chad, one thing I remember about the priority date was it had to do with the limited resources that were being allocated to schools and the timing of all of that. Now that we've gotten away from that because we have, I know we're not getting our allocations 2 years, we're still doing annual, but we have more opportunity to have some comfort level of what our allocations are. I'm wondering if that plays into this. Because you had the point in here that priority is not a guarantee of funding and priority date serves as a rationing tool. Mm-hmm. So that's the conversation I remember, is the rationing tool idea. Mm-hmm. So if we're getting to a point where our allocation model and timing is different, I'm wondering if that has an impact on this as well.
In this particular handout, the concept of the rationing tool was more rationing to the students, not rationing to the institutions, that there's a limited amount of money, you know, how do you figure out who to give it to, and here's a way to cut off groups of people, is what it ends up being, so, but.
I'm struck by a lot of our conversation is about what we believe the perception of students and parents is as to the date. Do we have any evidence from students and parents as to how they do perceive the date? Or are we just kind of working from assumptions that we make? And if we do work from assumptions, the one thing that I think is driving everything is most people, and I get this when I do my presentations, everything is, when's the deadline? And people aren't going to move until a deadline is hitting them and they feel like they got to do it then. I mean, I think that's a population of people, and I think that's just common in all of life, is people don't do anything until the deadline. Mm-hmm. That's just how we operate right now. And my fear of not having anything could mean we've lost any incentive, or we're losing incentives to get people at least to do it timely. I mean, what I try to say to people is, you know, the deadline really is the primary reason we want you to file early. Is the earlier you file, then the earlier we have opportunity to communicate to you what dollars you have available for college. So don't get hung up on a date, get it done so that we can communicate to you. You know, I mean, that's how I try to spin it, but all the nuances I know are just frustrating. But I do really wonder, how is it perceived by the students if we say that's what's important? Now, if other things are important, rationing, whatever it is, then, you know, then it is. But I think what's hard right now, I think currently in the state, is there's really not clarity of what really is the what are we trying to achieve by this date? Because it doesn't seem to really drive anything. It's what it sounds like, you know, how it is. So I don't think I've helped the situation at all. I've just stated the issue that, I mean, that my fear is if we don't give them something, then we're going to miss out on opportunity. And we're going to miss an opportunity to say, hey, you know, why didn't you get what you got? Well, we still operate primarily on a first come, first served basis. I mean, we have limited funds, and we still believe that a fairness issue of distributing funds is do it by who's first in line. I find that challenging a little bit sometimes too, because it's not the people who are first in line, it's the students who are in the back of the line that suffer from that, and they're the ones that often need the most help, and you know, and probably will help us achieve the goals of enrolling, retaining, and graduating students if we were more sensitive to the students who are on the back of the line, regardless of why they're on in the back of the line.
And that's definitely something that latter idea that you're mentioning about being back of the line is something that, like the Education Commission of the States and other organizations that have, you know, looked into this have talked about with time-based requirements, is that they can end up punishing students who have less access to information. And so your priority deadlines can end up benefiting those who have someone telling them to make sure you meet the priority deadline, who may also be the people that have someone telling them how to go to college and all the other things to make sure that they succeed, whereas those who don't have access to the information are the ones who end up being at the back of the line. So in terms of the rationing piece, I just want to mention that that's not something that I've ever heard anyone mention in the agency was the intent of the priority deadline when it was created. It's just something that I've heard observations from financial aid administrators and others that it has ended up being a rationing tool. So my understanding, you know, I wasn't around when it was created, but my understanding was that it was created with the idea of trying to incent individuals to make sure that they got their application completed. But from that standpoint, I don't know any of the background on why it was, you know, just for general academic teaching institutions, and why, you know, the statute didn't address two-year institutions, why it didn't address private institutions receiving state aid, you know. So I don't know the background on how it ended up only applying to a certain category.
So Chad, I guess I'm trying to figure out what you would need from the committee. So do you like a suggestion whether to keep the deadline or move it or eliminate it? Or?
I guess I'm looking for the input from the committee as to whether or not you know, we've talked about the priority financial aid deadline a couple times, have talked about the different things that it may have negative consequences on, as well as the, you know, the impact it does have, and trying to understand from the Financial Aid Advisory Committee, kind of first, is this something that you think should be on the agency's list of things that we should be trying to address? And then kind of B, if it is something we should be trying to address, is that something that we should be trying to see what we can do in rule in order to address it, or whether really the only way to address it would be to kind of get it out of statute and allow institutions to be able to make determinations for themselves. So let me just ask the first question. Are the challenges that have been brought up regarding the priority financial aid deadline, are those such that we really should be looking at trying to solve the negative impacts that's been observed? Or is the priority financial aid deadline something that you feel, you know, it's a necessary evil, for lack of a better term, that we should just leave it on the table and stop worrying about it?
So I remember being on the subcommittee that talked about this, that made the proposal a couple of years ago. I would really like the opportunity to go back and talk to some of the other subcommittee members and just poll them for what the issues are. I think a lot of those folk were in four-year public institutions, and it is a different population than the two-year public. So for us, I think it was this idea of how are we dealing with limited funds and what's the best thing to do, and we didn't have other legislative incentives to get people to file the Fafsa. Where the two-year institutions, it was pretty obvious that your populations were filing later anyway. So if we could bring it back to the next committee meeting, I'd love to have some conversations with people and just bring back some feedback.
That would be great. And it's too late to change anything for the next cycle anyway. This is definitely a talk about it and figure out whether or not there's a rule. And Diane brought up a key piece, that the majority of the representation on the FAFSA priority deadline subcommittee last time was four-year publics, because that's the group that it applies specifically to. Since that last discussion, there's been more discussion about the unintended, for lack of a better term, impact it has on 2 years, even though it doesn't apply to them, what it does to the student populations and student populations that think it applies to them, and things like that. So I think that it does need to be a stronger piece. Do you all feel that it's worthy of reconvening a subcommittee to really dig into this? Or do you think that you all can kind of do your outreach so that at the next meeting we can have a good, solid conversation?
I mean, of course, that would be a conversation that I would definitely want to bring up to staff to get some feedback, because just speaking in terms of, I need the mic. Speaking in terms of the way we use the priority deadline at my specific institution, it kind of drives our packaging philosophy. And although we get a significant amount of funding, we still have to have a way that we're able to distribute those funds fairly. So I think, with the elimination of a priority deadline, that would cause a lot of issues, because, you have some students who did apply early who may have not gotten as much as a student who did their FAFSA 2 days before classes begin. And I just think it's, somewhat of a fairness once students start observing their award packages and things like that, and they're going to question the financial aid offices. Well, how are y'all making the determination of who gets what? So it's definitely something that I would want to speak to, some of my colleagues and people back in my institution to see what do they think that impact would have on our university.
And I was just going to say, as I recall, when the priority deadline was first initiated, it was mainly to provide some consistency, and it was mainly with the four-year institutions, because that's where they felt like the consistency needed to happen. You couldn't really do it with two-year schools because of the population that are being served, and privates have always just been kind of a little different. But what I'm thinking is that if you don't have it, most schools are gonna have their priority deadline because of just what Joy said, because it drives your packaging philosophies and processes. And so I think you're gonna go back to being inconsistent again. And so I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
I wonder, go ahead, Denise.
As a two-year institution with transfer students going in, I would like to see the date later in the spring semester, just to give those students that are going to transfer a little bit of a window to say, oh, okay, so I had to do this, and now I can go on to the four-year institution. And in January, we haven't even started our spring semester yet by the time of the priority deadline. So there's no active, we can tell them in the fall, and we can preach it, and we can send out emails, and we can do all that. But until they get to that point where they're ready to make a decision, that January is just a really tight window for them. My 2 cents.
Would it be helpful maybe to look at some data from our schools and like number of completers, or at that date compared to as it was before, just to see if we saw an increase? Is it really making a difference? Would that be helpful for I know it creates some work, but would it be helpful for this context, or?
Does Shay remind me, FAD has a FAFSA date on it now? And this is the first year it's had the date, or last year was the first? So, okay, so we could actually pull that internally, because we would have the FAFSA filing date for anyone that filed a FAFSA, because technically you're supposed to report anyone who filed a FAFSA. And so we could look at some of that data to kind of see how it's falling. So yeah, we can do some research on that.
It might help, it might deviate us to look at another date that we may not have thought of too, by looking at the data.
Yep.
That could be.
Going back to Lynn's comment about kind of bringing the consistency and everything, and noticing that, hearing from you that the 4 years was where the inconsistency was mostly happening. I think, and tying that to the previous discussion we had in this committee that moved it from March 15th up to January 15th, I think a big piece that needs to be just considered and decided on is what is the impact of HB3 and the graduation FAFSA requirement, and to what extent that does or doesn't need to influence, because those decisions that were made before were all absent of that requirement. And now with that requirement, what exactly is that impact going to be if we've got two different deadlines for filing a FAFSA, one for financial aid and one for graduation? So I think back to what you guys were mentioning earlier when Sandy Baum was on the line, about the challenges you have trying to explain why you're eligible for state aid, but you're eligible for federal aid, but you're not eligible from state aid because there's two different rules. I just would imagine that's a whole nother set of counseling you're going to have, explaining to someone that, yes, you did what you were supposed to graduate, but not to get aid. Well, if I could then ask that you connect with your sectors, with your colleagues, with your staffs, to really, talk about this priority deadline concept, and, in the next meeting for us to be able to talk about, do we need to kind of just let it be and let it stay as it is, and see how things play out as HB3 goes into effect, et cetera, whether it's something we need to look at, tweaking the deadline in a different way, or whether it's something, of going a whole other direction. And then we will plan on continuing this discussion at the next meeting.
Yeah, thank you. You're up next.
Okay. In relation to that preliminary considerations, we had talked at the last Financial Aid Advisory Committee meeting about, I had put together information on just ideas that I had heard. And whenever I talk about this, there's the big, what do you call it, a caveat at the beginning, that the following ideas have been assembled based on prior Financial Aid Advisory Committee discussions, financial aid studies, recommendations from higher education organizations, and a general review of state financial aid statute. They do not reflect specific recommendations of the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board and are provided simply as a tool to encourage discussion and idea generation. So I just want to make sure that no one walks away from this thinking, oh, the coordinating board's going to change this. That's not what that is. This is just, these are the things that I've been hearing about and wanting to kind of understand what are things that we should kind of continue diving deeper into versus, are these things, not to worry about. And what I wanted to do today was just make sure everyone knew the feedback that I had received when I took these same ideas to the TASFA conference. We had talked here about the ideas, and I gathered your feedback from that, but I also went to the TASFA conference and used the state update as an opportunity to get people's input on these ideas. And definitely, when I brought up the idea of federal and state alignment, there was a lot of agreement in the auditorium, or whatever that big room we were in was, on the idea of trying to get those things better aligned. There were some additional pieces that were raised. We're looking at state record retention requirements and seeing to what extent could those align with federal. Repeat limits. There's repeat limits, coursework repeats in the federal, and whether those could be aligned with the states, as well as the eligible coursework requirements, which we might have talked about in the last time. But so that is a piece. It sounds like Shannon mentioned that the legislative committee is looking at those, and I would say that the financial aid community is in a much better position than I am to be able to really identify where are the state and federal misalignments, because quite frankly, I don't counsel students on a day-to-day basis anymore. And so you all see it much more as to where that's coming up. And so your input will be very helpful on that. Talked with them about this concept of the priority financial aid deadline. One of, in that, their feedback there, that group's feedback was, let us figure out what deadline is the best for what we need to do in our organization. Now that definitely would end up with having more inconsistency on that piece, and so kind of figuring out the balance of the inconsistency, when is the inconsistency more beneficial than consistency? In terms of work as a resource, talked with them about this idea that I had mentioned in the last time of thinking about work from a much broader perspective. We do have the Texas Works program that is going to start next summer. And so right now the rules are being developed for that. No, I think they're already posted for that, and they're preparing to be able to bring students into those internships. And we're also, looking at the different approaches. And, I did mention to them the concept that, over the past few years with Texas Work Study in particular, we haven't reallocated those funds, partially because the funds coming back at the point of the February deadline, there hasn't been enough to really make reallocation worthwhile. Not that that's all the money that's coming back. It's just what's happening is that's the only money we're being told about at that time. Then all of a sudden, later in the summer, we start getting all this money back. And so, there's a bit of a challenge there already. But also the fact I acknowledge to them, from even working in financial aid offices and having done stuff myself, that reallocations really weren't creating new work opportunities for students because the reallocations were coming so late in the year. People were just taking students who were eligible and flipping their institutional over onto state. So it wasn't creating more work opportunity. It was just adding a subsidy to work that had already been done. And I got the same nods that I just got from all of you, that, yep, it's just an accounting thing when that happens so late in the year. So we're definitely looking internally, at those pieces. One of the things that I was just reading the Texas Work Study rules the other day as part of the 4-year rule review that we do. And one of the things that I was noticing is that with the Texas Work Study, because of the current reallocation process, it's got that rule in the allocations that you can only use reallocated money for summer. You can't use your initial allocation for summer. And meanwhile, we've been trying to encourage summer financial aid programs. And so, I don't know whether we need to reopen a negotiated rulemaking to look at trying to create some of the flexibility with the work-study program that we have created with the grant program. And so that's something that we're thinking about internally. And then the group helped continue to flesh out the list of populations that either aren't served at all, don't qualify for any of our state grant programs, or are underserved. And that list continued to grow. Some of the particular ones that were mentioned was for-profit institutions, the career colleges, upper middle income families, things like that. Also, some of the things to be considered, going back to Sandy's discussion this morning, the decentralization of our aid program also means a lack of portability of grants. So it's kind of that 6 of one, half dozen the other, as to, you get some things by going one way, but then you get some issues going the other way. And so trying to look at those pieces. One piece that I'll admit I had never, it hadn't computed in my head from not administering the TEOG program, but one institution wrote me afterwards and talked about the fact because that in some cases they ran into a challenge that the TEOG matching requirement couldn't be accomplished because there was no unmet need remaining after the TEOG and the Pell were awarded. Because Pell can't be used as matching, and you awarded the TEOG not up to tuition, and then that and the Pell, because the tuition was so low, covered the unmet need, so they were technically out of compliance because they couldn't do the matching to get them up to the tuition requirement because there wasn't the need to do it. And I thought that was a very interesting perspective, that just having worked at very expensive private institutions for most of my career, didn't even cross my mind as to how that math was going to work. So those insights like that of just, here's the nitty-gritty, kind of in the weeds, in the trenches, awarding the aid, the challenges that we're facing, are really good insights to help us understand how some of these, the ways that things are written, have these unintended consequences that really weren't, I'm sure it was never intended that you would continue to match when there wasn't any financial need left over, but thus that's run into. So for the most part, the TASFA conference feedback was not significantly different in any way from the feedback that you all provided, which actually helps me because it increases the agency's confidence level that the Financial Aid Advisory Committee is providing us a good broad-based picture of the financial aid community as a whole, when I'm getting the same feedback from this smaller group as I am from a very large conference group. As John Wyatt mentioned, I love how I point to a person who's not even there. As John Wyatt mentioned earlier, the agency is looking at how we'll be developing concepts as to what are the critical areas for review, et cetera, and how might those even be looked at in the coming legislative cycle. And so the main thing that I've been saying is, to the work that I've been doing on these discussions with you all, is I want to have as much input and as much understanding of where the challenges lie and the concerns exist, so that if at some point in the future there's the opportunity to share that information and to talk about these things, I can already be ready to have those conversations, as opposed to saying someone, let me get back to you, and running and like asking a couple people and all of a sudden saying, okay, here's the idea. So, where this will go, have no idea, but want to make sure that I'm as informed as possible. So I would encourage you to continue to send me these concepts around these ideas of federal and state alignment, priority financial aid deadline, work as a resource, and populations that aren't served, as well as any just general straightforward statutory challenge. The way this is written, we find we can't do it because of this reason. And that way I can be best prepared for those discussions, because sometimes I don't even realize they're going to happen. We're in a meeting on something else, and all of a sudden there's an opportunity to bring it up. And so I like to have all of your knowledge that I'm representing what you think, not just here's my experience as an aid administrator. Anything? I just talked a whole bunch. I don't know that I even asked a question anywhere in there, but anything I say scare you? Maybe that's a good question. Am I totally off board on anything that I mentioned? No. Okay. I think I'm the final one as well. It's or the almost final one. Just some updates. Just wanted to kind of let you know what's happening. In terms of upcoming training activities, our monthly webcasts will resume in the new year. And so notifications will go out about those. There are deadlines that you should be paying attention to. One has already passed, and hopefully everyone met it, and we don't have anyone who hasn't done this. But just in case it's not accurate, if you haven't done your user access portal review, that was due November 15th. Please make sure that you have whomever is responsible at your institution, and all of you who are watching this broadcast, please pay attention to this deadline. We need your user access portal review so that we don't end up shutting off people from access, because at some point, if we don't have the feedback, we have to assume those people don't work there anymore, and so we have to shut off access. Your state campus-based programs report is due December 13th. Hopefully everyone has noticed that it is a simplified form. We eliminated a lot of unnecessary information from it, so I hope that it'll be simpler for you to do. I think there's even some cool formulas in there that do the calculations for you and the like, so Financial Aid Services is doing its best to streamline that form to get down to just the bare minimum of what's needed for our administration of those programs. And then, of course, the financial aid database. Your certification is due by December 16th. So can't emphasize enough how critical it is for you to get us that information by December 16th. I would say this year more than ever, the criticality so that we can have a good picture of the financial aid. As you all know, we have a new commissioner. I have no idea how quickly he is going to start asking questions about financial aid, and it would be very disappointing to have to tell him in February, I'm sorry I can't get you that information because we have schools that still haven't sent their information, to which he'll say, wasn't that deadline December 16th? And I'll say, uh-huh. So I really, really want to encourage you all to make sure that you meet that deadline, because we can't give good information to the individuals who are trying to influence and strengthen these programs if we don't have those details from you. And the Financial Aid Services team, they will help you. If you are out there listening, if you have problems, call. Don't struggle and try to prove that you can figure this out yourself. Get on the phone, call our toll-free number, and our accountants will work with you and get those issues solved with you. So we have a board upstairs that they all get to put little stars on the board when they get someone certified. I will admit I like the stars better than the cowbell that they rang the year before. That was a little rattling when they were doing the cowbell. But we will be there to help you through this process. Couple loan updates. You received a notification about the fact that we have eliminated the academic hold requirement. And so the report, is it the last report or is it the report we're about to send? The November report. So the November report that we sent, rather than it being the report to put holds on people, should be the report for you to take off holds from individuals, because the academic hold is no longer required from our standpoint. And so if we get calls from here saying, you know, the institution has told me that I have a hold on my account because, you know, I'm late paying and I can't pay right now, and what can you do? We're going to send them back to the institution to say, you know, let that institution know that, no, that hold should not be there anymore. As we mentioned, while it did serve as a function to help us in our collection efforts, it was a roadblock to achieving completion, and 60 by 30 tax is about completion, not about collecting on our loans. One institution, we have heard feedback, has suggested that we still continue to make reports available to institutions of individuals who are delinquent for their own loan counseling efforts. So that's something we're looking into as to how we might still share information to help you all in your counseling. We are later this month, early December, we're going to be starting some expanded due diligence to some of our more at-risk borrowers, things like grace counseling, of reaching out to them during grace to help make sure that they're aware, a little more frequent notifications and calls if they do go into delinquency in hopes of helping that population. And then next month, we are going to be implementing, streamlining our loan origination process such that loans for the vast majority of applicants should be available to institutions for certification within hours, if not minutes, of the student completing a successful application. Now, admittedly, if the borrower doesn't do it correctly to start with, there's the humps that we're going to help them get it solved. But if they do everything they're supposed to, we're guessing over 3/4 of the loans will just simply kick into a status of being available to certify on your end. So we hope that that will help streamline the process and reduce questions coming to you from students coming to you asking, how come you haven't certified my loan yet? And you're like, well, we haven't gotten it yet. We are doing our best to take ourselves out of the delay of that. Those were the major SFAP updates. As I ask almost every time, is there anything you hoped I was going to give you an update on that I didn't? Anything that I missed that you think is critical? Do you still feel we're headed in the right direction in terms of improving your lives? Because that's what we're trying to do.
Yes.
Okay. We will keep on working to make your life better.
Thank you. Okay. Next item on the agenda is topics for future meetings. Like I said, this is a new item, and put it in here in case there's something that you would like for the committee or the coordinating board to look into for the next meeting. I know it's a new item, so I don't know if we
Robert, I just have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Not that I have anything to suggest, but I'm curious with what the work that Sandy is doing. When are you expecting a report, and then how will that get translated back? Is there going to be a presentation back to the group?
Yeah, and actually, the one thing about the work that the Urban Institute is doing is that they're not doing that work for us. Urban Institute got a grant to do this work. We were lucky enough that they picked New Jersey and Texas as the two states to study. But they are still very focused on trying to make it useful information for us as a state. I believe that their grant just goes through the end of this year. So I believe that they're going to be wrapping stuff up. It might be early next year. But I believe that they'll be wrapping their stuff up within the coming months. And that's definitely, once they're have completed their study, we can look to have them come back and provide more information, and definitely can share that all with everyone once we actually have a physical report to go with. So, but I'm glad you brought that up, because I do want to re-mention that fact that we haven't commissioned them to do this study for us to then, drive our pieces. We're just going to be the fortunate benefactors of a bunch of research that's going to help us.
Okay. Any topics you would like to bring up in the future?
One thing I would be interested in maybe getting some talk as well as some perspective as with the proposals that are being made with the presidential candidates about free education, about loan forgiveness and all of that. Is there any thinking at the state level that if something like that were to move forward, what would that mean for state programs, and how would it really work? I mean, all of the proposals are fairly broad stroke and pie in the sky possibly, but sometimes pie in the sky becomes meat and potatoes on the table. So, yeah, I mean, is there any thinking that's taking place, or should there be thinking that's taking place as to how would that really change what we are doing here in the state of Texas?
So,
any other ideas?
I don't know if the timing would be for next time, but maybe for House Bill 3, how that's going to look on Applied Texas. Is it too soon for that, or something maybe to keep on our radar so that, just so we have an awareness and so we can start thinking about.
HB 3?
I'm sorry, for the.
For the e-TASFA.
Yeah, yes, for
the electronic.
Yes.
Now you've got me calling it e-TASFA as well.
I'm sorry. No, for the FAFSA completion in high school.
Oh, that requirement.
Yes,
okay.
yes, sorry.
Okay. One thing to be aware of is that TEA just released a video on their website, a webinar on the FAFSA requirement. And so as to what they have so far, they're still working on things, like they still have to come up with the common form for opting out and some of the specifics on those things, and still working through the details on with putting TASFA on the web, and then how will that interact so that TASFA information will be available to high schools so that they can do those things. I almost think that it may be worthwhile to just have a standing agenda item on TASFA on the web and the FAFSA requirements, so that every quarter, whatever information we have, we can share with you.
That would be most helpful. Thank you.
So I will definitely add that.
Can I show my ignorance again? So you ask about Applied Texas, the application for admission. Why would that have anything to do with the FAFSA completion? I know they have to do that to graduate, but it's not. How's it going to be tied to that?
The TASFA, the statute.
Not the TASFA.
No.
I thought you were talking about House Bill 3.
Yeah, I was going to answer your question.
Oh.
The linking them all together, the TASFA in the statute is required to be built on the Apply Texas platform.
Oh, yes, yes, yes.
And so those link together, and then those all link into the, what's that called? What do you go into? Counselor Suite. That's what I'm trying to say. Those all link into the Counselor Suite, where high school counselors can see
Got it.
where does someone stand on their Apply Texas application, where do they stand on their FAFSA application, and potentially where do they stand on their TASFA. So it's a circuitous route, but they all come together in the background in the same place, or someday they'll all come together in the background.
And as we start looking at, we're becoming more recruiters in the financial aid world, and we depend on that information. And so it might be helpful to have a little background on it. So thank you.
Well, Shannon, and something else I just learned yesterday about House Bill 3 requirements is that the nomination for the advisory committee was had an open date all the way through June, but they moved that forward. So now they're going to shut down the nominations next month because they want to start meeting as soon as the year opens. So if you are interested in participating in that committee, you have 1 month to be nominated.
Some items that I'm looking at trying to schedule folks for coming meetings, looking to hopefully have someone come and present on the pilot project for Pell Grants to dual credit students. Have someone who's willing to come and talk about that. Talk about the, another one would be Pell Grant for incarcerated students, and talk about how that program is going, have some people that would be available who are participating in that pilot project. And then one of the NASFA conferences that I thought was particularly interesting, topic that was more kind of broad-based discussion of issues as opposed to in the weeds of how you run a program. There was a presentation on recognizing hidden bias and professional judgment that I thought would be a good conversation for us all. If there are other conference sessions that you have seen at NASFA, at TASFA, at SWASFA, at TACUBO, at, I'll go on with the acronyms. Please don't hesitate to let me know if you think that some of those would translate well to a financial aid advisory committee discussion, and I'm happy to do the outreach to try to make those happen. When I do that, I do try to focus on things that are more about financial aid policy or financial aid kind of writ large, as opposed to getting into the nitty-gritty of, how am I using my SEOG money to best influence, graduation, or how to implement this particular, SAP requirement or something like that. But if ever you see something in one of your conferences that you attend that you think this would be great for the Financial Aid Advisory Committee, drop me a note and I'll see what I can do about making a connection and getting that scheduled.
Okay, anything else? Okay, good. All right, so the last item on the agenda is to adjourn. But, one thing I just realized that I did not introduce our new members at the beginning of this other meeting. Shame on me, I'm sorry, I apologize. But I do want to introduce our new members, Dr. Joy Thomas, Thomas Ratliff, and it just happened to be sitting all in the front. Yeah. Yeah. Dr. Foreman, Tom Thompson, Dr. Ben Nolan, Lynn, Tacey Anderson, and our future one will be Shanna, right? Shauna Norton. Oh, yeah. This Michelle Garrett. Yeah, sorry. Okay. Okay, so last item, adjournment. May I entertain a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second, as we move in second to adjourn. Any discussion? None? All right, those in favor say aye. Aye. All right, all those against say nay. No, right, good. We'll move. Yeah, yeah.